You think you know how your mind works. You think your thoughts are your own, that you see the world clearly, that your choices are free. But what if that's all an illusion? This is a journey through 100 mental traps, quirks, biases, and blind spots that shape how you see, remember, decide, and even exist. Some are simple, some are strange, and some are so deep they might change how you see reality itself. It doesn't get harder with every step, but it does get deeper. Until by the end, even the idea of you watching this video might not be as solid as it seems. This is level 1 to 100 cognitive illusions and biases. Let's begin. You tend to look for evidence that supports what you already believe and ignore or dismiss anything that challenges it. That's confirmation bias, and it quietly shapes the way you see the world. If you believe a certain diet is the healthiest, you'll notice every article and testimonial that praises it and overlook the studies or experiences that contradict it. If you think someone is rude, you'll remember every moment they seem short or dismissive, but forget the times they were kind or neutral. You collect supporting evidence like a lawyer building a case, not like a scientist looking for the truth. Even the way you search for information online is biased. You don't usually type, "Why might I be wrong?" You type, "Why I'm right." And search engines give you exactly what you're looking for. Social media makes it worse by surrounding you with people and content that already agree with you, creating an echo chamber where your views are constantly reinforced. Over time, your confidence grows, not because your ideas are becoming more accurate, but because you've filtered out anything that disagrees with them. The scary part is how natural it feels. You don't think you're being biased. You think you're just seeing the facts. But really, you're seeing a curated version of reality, one that fits your existing narrative. This makes it harder to change your mind, even when you should. Confirmation bias doesn't just protect your beliefs, it protects your identity. Challenging your views can feel like challenging who you are, but the truth doesn't care what you believe. You look at two lines that are the exact same length, but one of them looks longer, and your brain is absolutely convinced of it. That's the Müller-Lyer Illusion, one of the simplest and most famous visual tricks ever discovered. You'll see two horizontal lines. One has arrow tails pointing outward, and the other has arrowheads pointing inward. The one with inward pointing arrows always looks shorter, even though they're mathematically identical. You can measure them with a ruler. You can stare at them for minutes. You can know they're the same length, but the illusion doesn't go away. This happens because your brain is trying to do something useful. It's not just making random errors. The illusion plays on how we interpret depth and perspective in everyday life. When we see corners or angles in the real world, our brain automatically adjusts for distance. The arrows trick us into thinking one line is farther away, so we subconsciously scale its size to compensate. It's like your brain is trying to turn a 2D drawing into a 3D experience, and that translation introduces a glitch. What's powerful about the Müller-Lyer illusion is that it's not just a curiosity. It's a reminder that perception isn't passive. You're not just recording the world like a camera. Your brain is actively interpreting it, guessing, adjusting, and filling in gaps based on experience. And sometimes those guesses are wrong. Even when you know the truth, you still see the lie. That's not just a quirk of vision. It's a pattern you'll see over and over again in how the mind works. The illusion is just the beginning. The first number you hear sticks in your mind like a magnet, even if it's totally random, and it quietly influences everything that comes after. That's anchoring bias. Imagine you're shopping for a watch. The first one you see is $500. The next one is $300. Suddenly, $300 feels like a deal, even though it's still expensive. Nothing changed about the second watch, only your reference point did. That first number planted an anchor, and your brain used it to judge everything else. Anchoring doesn't just affect money. It shows up in negotiations, estimates, judgments, even guesses. If I ask you, is the Mississippi River longer or shorter than 2,000 miles? And then ask you to guess its actual length, your answer will likely hover near 2,000 miles, even if that number came out of nowhere. The same happens in courtrooms when prosecutors ask for extreme sentences. It makes any lesser punishment seem reasonable by comparison. Real estate agents set listing prices high, so buyers feel like they're getting a bargain after negotiation, even if the final price is still inflated. The strange thing is, even when you know the anchor is arbitrary or irrelevant, it still affects you. People have done studies where participants spin a wheel that lands on a random number, and then answer questions unrelated to the spin, but their answers are still biased toward that random number. The effect is so powerful, it's like your brain can't not use the anchor. Anchoring bias shows just how irrational we can be when it comes to making decisions. We like to think we weigh all the facts carefully, but often, the first piece of information we encounter sets the tone, and everything after that just follows its lead. The danger is that we rarely notice it happening. Anchoring hides in plain sight, influencing our choices without us realizing it, from the prices we accept to the goals we set, even to the expectations we have for ourselves. And once the anchor is dropped, it takes a lot of mental effort to pull it back up. You think you notice everything around you, but in reality, you miss far more than you realize. Change blindness is the illusion that we're constantly aware of our surroundings when, in fact, we often fail to notice even major changes happening right in front of us. You could be watching a movie scene and not realize that a character's shirt has changed color between shots. You could be having a conversation with someone and not notice if they've been swapped out for a different person entirely. Yes, that's actually been done in experiments. People nodded, kept talking, and didn't realize anything was different. This illusion reveals something profound about how your mind works. You don't take in the world like a camera. You take it in through fragments, focused points of attention, and your brain fills in the rest. It gives you the sense of a rich, stable picture, but much of that picture is an illusion built from assumptions, expectations, and memory. If something changes outside the spotlight of your attention, it often goes unnoticed. It's not because you're careless, it's because your brain is efficient. It assumes most of the world stays the same and only flags what seems important. But that assumption means you can miss things that are obvious in hindsight. Change blindness isn't just a quirky trick of the eye, it has real consequences. Witnesses to crimes often miss key details. Drivers fail to notice cyclists or pedestrians. We think we're observant, but our awareness is like a flashlight in a dark room. It only shows what we pointed at. The rest that fades into assumption. And yet, we walk through life with confidence, believing we're seeing the full picture. That quiet confidence is the illusion, and change blindness is the proof that what we miss might matter more than we think. You walk into a room and feel like everyone is looking at you, at your clothes, your hair, that tiny stain on your shirt you noticed in the mirror. It feels like a spotlight is following you, highlighting every awkward move or imperfect detail. But here's the twist. Almost nobody noticed. That's the spotlight effect. It's the tendency to dramatically overestimate how much other people are paying attention to you. In reality, most people are too busy thinking about themselves to notice or remember much about you. That awkward comment you made? You replay it in your head for hours, but chances are no one else gave it a second thought. That time you tripped, said the wrong name, or wore mismatched socks. You were mortified, but for others, it was a passing moment, if they even noticed it at all. The spotlight effect comes from the simple fact that we live inside our own heads. We experience our thoughts, emotions, and self-consciousness with full intensity, so we assume others are tuned in at the same level. But they're not. They're under their own spotlights, worrying about their own flaws and fumbles, not watching your every move. This illusion can make us overly cautious, anxious, or afraid to take risks. We avoid raising our hands, speaking up, or being vulnerable because we think we're being constantly judged. But in truth, everyone's caught up in their own worries, just like you. The spotlight that feels so blinding is mostly in your imagination. And the moment you realize that, you start to feel a little freer, because nobody is watching nearly as closely as you think. Your brain tends to judge how likely or common something is based on how easily you can think of an example. That's the availability heuristic. If you just saw a plane crash on the news, flying suddenly feels more dangerous, even though statistically, it's still incredibly safe. If someone close to you recently got sick after eating out, you might feel like restaurant food is suddenly riskier than it really is. When something is vivid, recent, dramatic, or emotionally charged, it sticks in your memory, and your brain mistakes that ease of recall for frequency or truth. This mental shortcut helps you make quick decisions without needing all the data, but it can seriously distort your perception of reality. You might think crime is getting worse because you hear about it more often, even though overall crime might be decreasing. You might believe shark attacks are common because they're unforgettable, even though you're far more likely to be injured by a ladder than a shark. The media plays a big role in this. It floods your mind with rare, dramatic events, making them feel normal or frequent just because they're memorable. What's tricky is that the availability heuristic feels natural. You're not consciously trying to misjudge the world. You're relying on what comes to mind first. But what comes to mind isn't always what matters most. Just because something is easy to remember doesn't mean it's common, and just because something is hard to imagine doesn't mean it's rare. Your memory is a highlight reel, not a census. Recognizing that can help you make better decisions, especially when the facts don't feel as loud as the stories. You tend to believe that most people think like you do, that your opinions are normal, your values are common, and your preferences are widely shared. This is the false consensus effect, and it creates a kind of mental bubble where your perspective feels like the default. If you love a particular show, you assume everyone must know about it. If you hold a strong political belief, you're likely to think it's the obvious reasonable position and wonder how anyone could possibly disagree. This bias gives you the comforting illusion that your views are part of a shared reality, when in fact, they might be far less common than you think. It shows up everywhere, in social media arguments, in voting behavior, even in everyday conversations. People tend to overestimate how many others would lie to protect a friend, how many would cheat on a test, how many believe in the same conspiracy theory, or in none at all. And the more emotionally charged or identity-based a belief is, the stronger the illusion becomes. We don't just think others agree with us. We assume the ones who don't must be uninformed, biased, or extreme. The false consensus effect can lead to poor decision-making, overconfidence, and a failure to understand others. It can cause people to speak for everyone when they're really just speaking for themselves. And it makes disagreement feel more personal than it actually is, because it feels like a rejection, not just of your opinion, but of what you assumed was common sense. Ironically, this bias is also why we're surprised when reality contradicts us, when we find out that our view is actually in the minority, or that people we thought we understood turn out to think very differently. It can be a humbling experience to realize that your version of normal is just that, your version. The world is full of people living in different bubbles, each convinced that most people think the way they do. And when those bubbles collide, it's not always pretty, but it can be eye-opening. You think the odds will even out, that after a streak of bad luck, you're due for a win. That's the gambler's fallacy. The belief that past random events somehow affect future ones. Flip a coin and get 5 heads in a row. You feel like tails has to be next. But the truth is, the coin doesn't care. Each flip is still 50-50, completely independent of the ones before it. This illusion shows up all the time, not just in casinos. If your lucky number hasn't come up in a while, you might bet on it more heavily, thinking it's overdue. If your favorite sports team has lost 5 games in a row, you might believe they're bound to win the next one, even if nothing's changed about their chances. The mind can't help but look for patterns, even in pure randomness. It's comforting to think there's order, a kind of fairness built into the chaos. But randomness doesn't work that way. There's no invisible scorekeeper making sure things stay balanced. A roulette wheel landing on red 5 times doesn't make black more likely next. It's still just chance. The fallacy tricks you into thinking nature owes you something, like luck has a memory, like the universe will make things right if you just hang on long enough. The danger is that it fuels risk. You double down on bets, make irrational choices, chase losses, all because you believe the next outcome is due. But the universe isn't keeping a ledger. It's just rolling dice. Recognizing the gambler's fallacy doesn't stop bad luck, but it stops you from turning it into worse decisions. Your memory has a strange preference. It tends to hold on more tightly to the last thing you heard or saw. That's the recency effect. When you're given a list of items, you're more likely to remember the last few better than the ones in the middle. It's not just about lists either. Think about conversations, presentations, or arguments. People often remember your closing words more than anything else you said. If a movie has a great ending, it can redeem a boring beginning. If a speech ends on a powerful note, the whole thing feels more impressive than it really was. This bias shows up in everyday choices too. When you're deciding what to eat, the last restaurant someone mentioned might stick in your mind more than earlier suggestions. In job interviews, the final candidate can seem more impressive just because they're fresh in your memory. If you binge watch videos, you might feel more influenced by the last one you saw, even if it wasn't the most informative or entertaining. And when you reflect on your day, the way it ended, peacefully or stressfully, can shape how you feel about the whole thing. The recency effect happens because your short-term memory is like a mental spotlight. Whatever just entered it is still glowing, still vivid, still echoing in your mind. But this means your perception of reality can be easily distorted. You might overvalue something just because it came last, not because it was actually the best or most important. Understanding the recency effect is like catching your mind in the act of playing favorites. It reminds you that what's freshest isn't always what's truest, and that sometimes, to see clearly, you need to step back and remember the bigger picture, not just the final frame. The first thing you hear often sticks with you the most. That's the primacy effect. Your mind gives extra weight to whatever shows up first, even if it's not the most accurate or important. Imagine you're reading a list of names. You're far more likely to remember the first few than the ones in the middle. Or think about when someone gives you a description of a person. If they start by saying, "He's really smart," your brain forms a positive impression early on, and everything you hear afterward tends to fit that narrative. But if they start with, "He's kind of difficult," your whole perception shifts, even if the rest of the description is glowing. This bias shows up in arguments, first impressions, marketing, and even job interviews. The opening move shapes the frame. In a debate, whoever speaks first often sets the tone. In school, if the first lesson in a subject is exciting or boring, it can shape how you feel about the entire course. That's why headlines matter. That's why brand names you hear first become the ones you trust more, even when the quality isn't better. The primacy effect doesn't just live in memory, it influences your judgment. First impressions aren't just sticky, they're sticky in a way that can override later information. You could meet someone who makes a bad first impression and later shows you they're kind and trustworthy. But that initial impression will still linger, quietly pulling your opinion back toward it. Your brain likes shortcuts. It says, "Let's build the foundation with the first thing we hear," and often it never bothers to rebuild it, even if better information comes along. The result is a bias that feels completely natural, but quietly warps how you perceive, remember, and decide, simply because something came first. You don't know how little you know, and that's the Dunning-Krueger effect. It's a bias where people with low ability in a certain area overestimate how skilled or knowledgeable they are. It doesn't mean they're arrogant or intentionally misleading. It means they genuinely believe they understand something better than they do. And the reason is simple. The same skills that help you perform well are the ones you need to recognize what good even looks like. So, when you're lacking in those skills, you're also lacking the ability to realize your own limitations. You see this all the time. A beginner who just learned a few buzzwords in psychology suddenly acts like an expert on human behavior. Someone who watched a few YouTube videos about nutrition gives out bold diet advice with total confidence. And maybe you've had the experience yourself, starting something new and feeling like you've got it all figured out, only to later realize how complex it really is. Interestingly, the reverse is also true. People who are highly competent tend to underestimate themselves, because the more you learn, the more aware you become of everything you don't know. So while the least skilled often feel overconfident, the most skilled can feel uncertain. That mismatch creates a weird social tension. People with the loudest voices and most confidence aren't always the ones with the most insight, and those with the deepest understanding may hesitate to speak up, unsure if they're truly qualified. The Dunning-Kruger effect isn't just about knowledge. It can apply to any skill: driving, writing, public speaking, even self-awareness. And it's not something you outgrow. In fact, you could be under its spell right now without realizing it. That's what makes it so powerful. The real danger isn't just being wrong, it's being wrong and convinced you're right. Humility, curiosity, and a willingness to be wrong are the best antidotes. The moment you start to wonder, "What am I missing?" you've already taken a step out of the illusion. After something happens, it suddenly feels obvious. You look back and say, "I knew that was going to happen," even though in the moment you probably didn't. That's hindsight bias, the mental illusion that makes events seem more predictable than they actually were. Once you know the outcome, your brain rewrites the story, smoothing over uncertainty and making it feel like you saw it coming all along. You see this in everything from sports games to stock market crashes to historical events. After a team loses, fans say the signs were clear. After a crisis, people point to the warning signs everyone supposedly missed. But before it happened, those same signs were buried in noise, surrounded by a dozen other possibilities. Hindsight bias distorts how we learn from experience. It makes us overconfident in our judgment and unfairly critical of others who should have known better. We blame decision makers for not anticipating things that only look clear in the rearview mirror. The bias also changes how we view ourselves. You might look back at a failed relationship or a bad investment and think, I should have known better, not realizing that your current perspective is coloring your memory of the past. It wasn't obvious then. If it were, you would have acted differently. But your mind edits the past to fit what you now know, creating a false sense of clarity. This illusion can be comforting because it makes the world feel more orderly and understandable. But it's also dangerous. It keeps us from being humble about the limits of our foresight. It makes it harder to forgive mistakes, our own and other people's, and it turns the messy, uncertain present into a tidy, predictable past that never really existed. You probably think you're better than average. Most people do. Smarter than average, kinder than average, more self-aware, more capable. But statistically, we can't all be above average at the same time. That's the illusion of illusory superiority, a mental bias where people consistently overestimate their own qualities compared to others. It's why nearly everyone thinks they're an above-average driver, even though half the people on the road have to be below average by definition. It's why students rate themselves as more ethical, more intelligent, and more hard-working than their peers. And it's why people often believe they're less biased than everyone else. This illusion isn't just amusing, it shapes how we behave. It makes us underestimate how much we still have to learn. It causes us to judge others more harshly while giving ourselves the benefit of the doubt. It tricks us into thinking we're more rational, more open-minded, or more insightful than the people we argue with. And because this belief feels good, we rarely stop to question it. Illusory superiority also shows up in relationships and workplaces. You might think you contribute more to a group project than your teammates, or that you're a better communicator than your partner, even when they don't agree. In conflict, it leads to a frustrating cycle. Both sides feel morally superior. Both think the other is the problem, and both are convinced they're being more reasonable. What's wild is that this illusion can coexist with self-doubt. You might feel insecure about certain things, but still believe, deep down, that you're generally better than most people. That's because superiority doesn't always come from confidence. It often comes from comparison. And when we compare ourselves to others, we tend to focus on their visible flaws and our invisible intentions. The illusion of being above average isn't necessarily bad. It can boost motivation, help us recover from setbacks, and give us a sense of control. But when we take it too far, it becomes a blind spot. It stops us from growing, from listening, from understanding. And sometimes, the most superior thing you can do is admit you're not. You hear about the success stories, the entrepreneurs who made millions, the people who dropped out of school and became famous, the artists who struggled for years and finally broke through. And it makes you think, if they did it, so can I. But what you don't hear about are the thousands of others who followed the same path, worked just as hard, and failed quietly. That's survivorship bias. It's the illusion that success is more common than it really is, simply because the failures didn't make it into the spotlight. We celebrate the businesses that survived the market, the planes that made it home, the diets that worked, the strategies that led to victories. But we rarely look at the full picture. The stories that survive tend to be the exceptions, not the rule. During World War II, analysts wanted to reinforce planes where they found bullet holes, until a statistician pointed out that those were the planes that came back. The ones that got shot elsewhere never returned. That insight, realizing what's missing from the data, is the heart of overcoming survivorship bias. It affects everything from investing to health advice to motivation. People say, follow your passion, it worked for Steve Jobs, without considering how many passionate people didn't make it. We love before and after photos, but ignore the people who tried the same thing and saw no change. Survivorship bias turns anecdotes into evidence and inspiration into distortion. It makes success look easy and failure look like a personal flaw instead of part of the bigger, invisible trend. The problem isn't being inspired by those who made it, it's forgetting how many didn't. Survivorship bias doesn't just make us overconfident, it also makes us unfair, because we judge outcomes without seeing the hidden costs, the untold failures, and the people who took the same leap but never landed. To really understand success, you have to listen for the silence, the voices that didn't make it through. The way something is presented can completely change how you feel about it, even if the actual facts stay the same. That's the framing effect. Imagine you're told a medical procedure has a 90% survival rate. Sounds reassuring, right? But now, imagine you're told it has a 10% mortality rate. Suddenly it feels riskier, even though both statements mean exactly the same thing. The information didn't change, just the way it was framed, and that subtle difference in wording can shift decisions, emotions, and beliefs in powerful ways. Framing shapes how we think about risks, rewards, and responsibilities. A politician says they're cutting taxes rather than reducing government services. A company advertises 95% fat-free instead of 5% fat. A charity tells you you can save a life instead of someone might die if you don't donate. Each version pushes your mind in a different direction. One feels positive, the other negative. One feels hopeful, the other scary. And often we don't even realize we've been nudged. We just feel like we're making a rational choice. This effect doesn't just influence marketing or media, it affects how we judge people, make financial decisions, and even vote. When a problem is framed as a potential loss, we become more cautious or even irrationally afraid. When it's framed as a gain, we tend to take more risks or feel more optimistic. And the scary part? We can be manipulated simply by how a question is worded, how an option is described, or even how a story is told. The framing effect reveals just how fragile objectivity can be. It's not just what you're told that matters, it's how it's told. And once you start noticing it, you'll see it everywhere, in headlines, debates, advertisements, and even your own thoughts. Your brain craves meaning and clarity, but it's surprisingly easy to steer it without changing a single fact. You're more likely to believe something, buy something, or support something simply because other people do. That's the bandwagon effect. It's the psychological pull of popularity. When a trend starts gaining momentum, when a belief seems widely accepted, or when a product starts flying off shelves, something in your mind quietly whispers, maybe they know something I don't. You might not even like the thing at first, but as more people join in, your resistance starts to fade. Suddenly the music sounds better, the movie seems more interesting, and the opinion feels more correct, just because it's everywhere. The bandwagon effect isn't just about fads or fashion. It shapes elections, stock markets, and social movements. People vote for candidates they think are winning. They invest in companies because everyone else is. They shift their views to match the loudest voices, not necessarily the most thoughtful ones. It can create feedback loops where beliefs snowball into assumed truths, not because they're right, but because they're repeated. And here's the twist. We often don't notice we're doing it. We tell ourselves we're making informed, independent decisions. But the truth is, popularity is persuasive. When something becomes widely accepted, it gains an aura of legitimacy, even if it started out as a mistake, a marketing gimmick, or a misunderstanding. Sometimes the crowd is right, but not always. The bandwagon effect doesn't ask whether something is good, true, or meaningful. It just rewards what's popular. And in a world of trends, algorithms, and viral everything, the hardest thing to do is step back and ask, do I really believe this? Or am I just going along for the ride? You've already spent the money, already put in the time, already given your energy, and now, even though it's clearly not working, you don't want to walk away. That's the sunk cost fallacy. It's the feeling that because you've invested so much, you have to keep going, even if it no longer makes sense. Maybe it's a movie that's boring 30 minutes in, but you tell yourself, I already paid for the ticket. Or a relationship that's been painful for years, but you think, I've already put so much into this. Or a business idea that's losing money, but you say, we can't stop now. We've come too far. The truth is, those past investments, your time, your money, your emotional effort, are gone. They're what economists call sunk costs, and they can't be recovered. But your brain doesn't want to admit that. It treats those losses like a debt that can still be paid back if you just push a little further. The problem is, by clinging to the past, you risk wasting even more of your future. The longer you stay locked into a bad decision, the more you lose, because you're trying to justify something that can't be undone. What makes the sunk cost fallacy especially dangerous is how emotional it is. It's not just about logic, it's about pride, fear, and hope. Walking away can feel like failure. It can feel like admitting you were wrong. But in reality, it's often the smartest, most courageous move you can make. The real question isn't, how much have I already spent? But, what would I choose if I were starting fresh right now? That question cuts through the illusion and brings you back to clarity. Letting go isn't giving up, it's choosing wisely. It's refusing to throw more of yourself into something just because you already did. And sometimes, that's the hardest and most liberating decision of all. You think something will take an hour, and somehow it ends up taking 3. You're not lazy, and you didn't plan poorly on purpose, but your brain tricked you into thinking things would go more smoothly than they actually did. That's the planning fallacy. It's the mental habit of underestimating how long a task will take, even when you've done similar tasks before and should know better. You might promise to finish a project by the weekend, start packing for a trip the night before, or think you can renovate a room in just a few days. And when it takes twice as long, you act surprised, even though it always happens. The strange part is that the planning fallacy doesn't usually go away with experience. Even if you've messed up timelines 100 times, your brain still leans toward the optimistic estimate. Why? Because you tend to picture the ideal version of how things will go, without interruptions, without setbacks, without the random chaos of real life. You focus on the task itself, not all the invisible steps around it. The emails you'll have to answer, the unexpected problems, the lost motivation halfway through. In your mind, everything flows. In reality, everything delays. It gets worse in group settings. Teams, committees, or companies make big plans with ambitious timelines, and everyone agrees, partly because optimism feels good, and partly because no one wants to be the downer who says, actually, this might take twice as long. So budgets get blown, deadlines get missed, and people scramble to make up for it at the last minute. And the cycle repeats. The planning fallacy reveals just how deep our desire is to believe we're in control. It's comforting to think we'll stick to the schedule, that we'll work efficiently, that the future is predictable. But being realistic isn't pessimism, it's wisdom. Every time we ignore the past and expect the best-case scenario, we set ourselves up for stress, disappointment, and unfinished plans. The trick isn't to stop making plans. It's to build in the delays, distractions, and detours you already know are coming. When things go right, you take the credit. When they go wrong, you blame something else. That's the self-serving bias, and almost everyone does it. If you ace a test, it's because you're smart or you studied hard. If you fail, well, the questions were unfair, or you were tired, or the teacher didn't explain things well. In sports, if your team wins, it's because you played great. If your team loses, it's because the ref made terrible calls. This bias protects your self-esteem. It's a way of keeping your sense of identity intact. You build a version of reality where you're always the hero, or at least never the villain. The self-serving bias doesn't just affect how you explain events to others. It changes how you interpret reality for yourself. It feels good to believe you're in control when things go well. It feels even better to believe external forces are to blame when they don't. It's not about lying. It's about the mind choosing the story that makes you feel better. And it's a story we tell ourselves constantly, often without noticing. I got the promotion because I earned it, but I didn't get it because the manager plays favorites. Or, that relationship ended because they were difficult. Not, maybe I had something to work on too. The danger of the self-serving bias is that it can get in the way of growth. If you're never at fault, you never need to change. If you always credit yourself for success, you might miss the role of luck, timing, or the support of others. Over time, it can lead to arrogance, blame shifting, and fragile self-worth that cracks the moment reality doesn't cooperate. But the truth is, life is messy. Sometimes you do everything right and still fail. Sometimes you mess up and still win. Seeing that clearly, without always protecting your ego, isn't easy. But it's one of the most powerful steps toward real self-awareness. When someone has one impressive quality, like being attractive, confident, or successful, you tend to assume they have a bunch of other positive traits too, even if there's no reason to think so. That's the halo effect. It's like one bright light in a person's personality blinds you to everything else. If someone is charming, you might also think they're smart. If they dress well, you might assume they're competent. If they speak confidently, you might take their opinions more seriously, even if they're completely wrong. This bias affects how we hire people, how we vote, who we trust, and even who we fall for. Celebrities get away with bad behavior because their public image shines so brightly. A teacher who's friendly might get higher ratings from students, regardless of whether they're actually teaching well. The opposite is true too. If someone rubs you the wrong way once, their whole character might look darker than it really is. That's called the horn effect, but it's just the same illusion, flipped. The halo effect doesn't just shape how we judge other people, it also influences how we see ourselves. If you're good at one thing, you might overestimate your abilities in areas you've never even tried. You might assume that because you're successful in your career, your views on politics or relationships must be sharp too. The reality is, different traits don't always come bundled together. Being good at one thing doesn't guarantee being good at another. But your brain wants to simplify the picture. It wants people to be either good or bad, not a mix. So, it fills in the blanks, and often it gets them wrong. The halo effect is comforting because it makes the world feel more predictable. But it also leads to snap judgments, missed opportunities, and unfair advantages. Someone with substance might be overlooked because they don't shine right away. And someone with style but little depth might be trusted more than they should be. The truth is, people are complex. One good trait doesn't mean everything else is glowing too, but the glow is hard to resist. You look at something random and see a pattern that isn't really there. That's the clustering illusion. It's your brain's built-in habit of searching for order in chaos, of connecting the dots even when they were never meant to be connected. If you flip a coin 5 times and get heads each time, you might feel like tails is due next, like there must be some hidden balance trying to work itself out. Or if you see 3 people wearing red shirts in a row, you might wonder if something's going on, even though it's just coincidence. We're uncomfortable with randomness, so we try to impose meaning on it. This illusion is why gamblers think certain slot machines are hot, why people feel lucky or cursed, and why conspiracy theories can feel so convincing. Random events start to look like deliberate patterns. A few celebrity deaths close together becomes a celebrity curse. A cluster of illnesses sparks fears of a hidden cause. But in reality, randomness clumps, like raindrops on a windshield or stars in the sky. Things that are scattered randomly often end up forming clusters just by chance. The clustering illusion tricks us into seeing significance where there is none. And once we notice a supposed pattern, our brain starts reinforcing it. We remember the times it held up and ignore the times it didn't. It's comforting to think that things happen for a reason, that chaos is secretly structured, but randomness doesn't owe us a story. Sometimes things group up for no reason at all, and the hardest part is accepting that there's no deeper meaning behind it. Just coincidence, and the mind's relentless drive to find patterns in the noise. You tend to judge others more harshly than you judge yourself, especially when they make mistakes, and that's called the fundamental attribution error. When someone cuts you off in traffic, you assume they're a selfish or reckless person. But when you cut someone off, it's because you were late, distracted, or just having a bad day. The same mistake, 2 very different stories. You see their actions as a reflection of their character, but yours as a response to the situation. This happens all the time. If a coworker misses a deadline, you might think they're lazy or incompetent. But if you miss one, it's because of a valid reason. Too many meetings, unexpected issues, a tight schedule. You give yourself the benefit of the doubt, but not always others. And the closer someone is to you, family, friends, you might extend that generosity. But for strangers, the snap judgment tends to stick. What's wild is that everyone's doing this to everyone else. You're judging someone else's character based on limited information, while they're doing the same to you. The result is a world full of misunderstandings, people constantly misreading each other, assuming the worst, and rarely stopping to ask, what else might be going on? The truth is, most people are just reacting to the pressures around them, the same way you are. But the fundamental attribution error keeps us locked in a loop where we blame people instead of context, and in doing so, miss the bigger picture. Bad things stick with you more than good things do. That's the core of negativity bias. You might get 10 compliments in a day, but if one person insults you, that's the one you remember. It's not just an emotional quirk. It's a deep, built-in survival mechanism. For most of human history, noticing danger was far more important than enjoying comfort. If you missed a beautiful sunset, nothing happened. If you missed a predator in the bushes, you were dead. So, our brains evolved to prioritize anything that seems threatening, painful, or unpleasant. Negativity bias shows up everywhere in how we judge people, remember events, or make decisions. A single awkward moment at a party can make you feel like the whole night was a failure. You could get 95% on a test and still obsess over the one question you missed. When reading reviews, your eyes go straight to the one-star comments, even if the rest are glowing. Politicians know this bias well, which is why fear-based messaging works so effectively. The news understands it too. Stories about disasters, scandals, and tragedies dominate headlines, not because the world is only getting worse, but because that's what captures our attention. This bias even affects relationships. You might feel more hurt by a partner's one sarcastic remark than uplifted by weeks of kindness. Negative emotions are louder, stickier, and heavier. They take over your mind faster and fade more slowly. It's not that positive things don't matter, they do, but they have to work harder to be noticed, remembered, and believed. Recognizing negativity bias doesn't mean ignoring what's bad. It just means learning not to let it define your entire perception. The mind is like Velcro for bad experiences and Teflon for good ones. But if you're aware of it, you can start to balance the scale. When you're faced with a specific story or detail, you tend to ignore the bigger picture, the actual statistics that matter. That's base rate neglect. Imagine someone tells you about a quiet, bookish guy who loves libraries and wears glasses. You're then asked, is he more likely to be a truck driver or a librarian? Most people say librarian because the description sounds like a librarian. But the truth is, there are way more truck drivers than librarians. Statistically, it's much more likely that he's a truck driver, even if the details don't fit the stereotype. Base rate neglect happens when we forget how common or rare something is in the general population. We get caught up in the vividness of a story, or in how representative a person or situation feels, and we tune out the raw numbers. You might hear about a charismatic young entrepreneur who dropped out of college, started a company in his garage, and became wildly successful. It sounds like the classic genius success story. So when someone else drops out of school to follow their dream, you might think, this could be the next Steve Jobs. But you're ignoring the base rate, the overwhelming number of people who try the same thing and fail. The odds aren't magically better because the story feels familiar. This bias shows up in hiring, in news stories, in politics, anywhere we weigh decisions based on descriptions instead of probabilities. If someone seems like the type for a role, we might overlook their actual qualifications, or how many similar people have succeeded or failed in that position before. We love the story more than the stats. Base rate neglect feels intuitive, but it leads to poor decision-making. We focus on the anecdote instead of the trend. We believe in the exceptional case instead of the everyday reality. And we forget that what usually happens matters more than what sounds like it could happen. To think more clearly, we need to look past the story, consider the actual numbers, and remind ourselves that a good story doesn't always mean a likely outcome. You're more likely to believe something is true just because an authority figure said it. That's authority bias. When someone wears a lab coat, speaks confidently, or has a fancy title, your brain gives their words extra weight, even if what they're saying doesn't hold up under scrutiny. It's not always about credentials either. It can be a boss, a parent, a teacher, a celebrity, or even just someone who seems to know what they're talking about. The moment they step into that role, your critical thinking takes a step back. This bias shows up in ways that are surprisingly automatic. If a doctor gives a diagnosis, most people accept it without getting a second opinion, even when the symptoms don't fully match. If a headline starts with "experts say," we're more likely to agree before we've even read the details. In marketing, it's why companies use actors dressed as professionals or quote vague studies to sell products. It's why people fall for scams where someone pretends to be from the IRS or the police. They're tapping into our instinct to obey perceived authority. Authority bias can be helpful. In many situations, trusting experts saves time and energy. But it becomes dangerous when it's automatic, when we defer to authority without asking questions, or when we silence our own judgment because they must know better. History is full of examples where bad decisions were carried out just because someone in charge gave the order. People ignored their own discomfort, their own logic, because the person giving instructions had a badge, a clipboard, or a title. The real challenge is finding balance, respecting knowledge without surrendering your ability to think. Because authority doesn't guarantee truth. Sometimes the most valuable insight comes from questioning the very people we're taught never to doubt. You probably feel that doing nothing is safer than doing something, even if the outcome is the same, or worse. That's omission bias, the mental shortcut where inaction feels less harmful, less blameworthy than action. If a doctor gives a treatment that causes harm, people tend to blame them more than if the doctor did nothing and harm happened anyway, even when the result is identical. It's as if choosing not to act somehow makes you less responsible, even though the decision not to intervene is still a choice. This bias shows up in daily life in subtle ways. You might avoid giving honest feedback because you're afraid of hurting someone's feelings, even if staying silent allows a bad situation to continue. You might not vote, thinking your inaction is neutral, even though that inaction still contributes to the outcome. In relationships, it's easier to avoid hard conversations, to let things slide, and to hope problems sort themselves out. But avoidance has consequences, and omission isn't neutral, it's just quieter. What makes omission bias so powerful is that it feels like a moral safety net. Taking action comes with visible consequences and potential guilt. Inaction lets you hide behind the illusion of innocence. You didn't cause the harm, you just didn't stop it. But deep down, part of you knows that turning away is still a form of participation. Choosing nothing is still a choice. Omission bias can be comforting, but it can also let injustice, conflict, and mistakes persist longer than they should. It tempts you to keep your hands clean at the cost of letting something wrong continue. Sometimes doing nothing is the riskiest move of all. When someone else messes up, you tend to blame their personality. They're careless, lazy, selfish, or just not trying hard enough. But when you mess up, the story changes. You blame the situation. You were tired, distracted, under pressure, or dealing with things people don't see. That's the actor-observer bias, and it's one of the most common distortions in the way we judge behavior, ours and others. It works like this. When you're the actor in a situation, you see all the context around your actions. You know what led up to your decision, what your intentions were, and what pressures you were under. But when you're the observer, especially of someone you don't know well, you see just the action itself. Someone cuts you off in traffic, they're a jerk. But when you do it, you're just late or flustered or didn't see them. A friend forgets your birthday, they're selfish. But when you forget theirs, you're just overwhelmed. This bias doesn't come from malice, it comes from perspective. You live inside your own head, surrounded by your reasons and your justifications, but you don't live inside anyone else's. So, when you look at them from the outside, it's easy to forget that their world is just as complicated as yours. Actor-observer bias creates a double standard in how we assign blame, and it can quietly erode relationships. It makes you more forgiving of yourself than of others, and that imbalance over time can lead to resentment, misunderstanding, and the illusion that you're being fair when you're actually not. But once you know it's there, you can start to slow down. Instead of jumping to, "they're just that kind of person," you can pause and wonder, what might they be dealing with? It's not about excusing everything, it's about remembering that people, like you, are usually more than what they appear to be in a single moment. You assume that other people think, feel, and see the world the same way you do. And that's projection bias. It's the mental shortcut, where you take your current thoughts, values, or emotional state and project them onto others, expecting them to react just like you would. If you're excited about something, you might assume everyone else will be too. If you're anxious or frustrated, you might interpret someone else's silence as anger or disapproval, even if they're just tired or distracted. You treat your internal state like it's the default setting for everyone else. It also shows up in planning and decision-making. When you're calm and full, it's hard to imagine what you'll want when you're stressed or hungry. You might underestimate how much food you'll need, how tired you'll feel tomorrow, or how hard a future task will be, because you're projecting your present self onto your future self. You assume consistency, when in reality, your mind changes all the time. Projection bias distorts empathy. You might think you're being understanding, when really, you're just imagining how you would feel in their situation. But their background, temperament, and mental wiring might be completely different. When someone reacts in a way that doesn't make sense to you, it can feel irrational, not because it is, but because your default lens can't account for it. You can miss what they're actually experiencing because you're too busy seeing yourself in their place. It also affects relationships. You might believe someone's upset with you just because you're feeling insecure. Or you might give a gift that you would love and feel surprised when they're underwhelmed. You might argue passionately about a topic and assume anyone who doesn't agree must be uninformed or disingenuous, because if you were in their shoes, you would agree. That's the trap, mistaking your own perspective for a universal truth. The more we become aware of projection bias, the more we can pause and ask, is this really about them, or is it about me? That small question can shift how we relate to others, plan for ourselves, and even think about the world. Because understanding someone else doesn't start with imagining how you'd feel. It starts with recognizing that you're not them. You tend to believe that things will work out better for you than for other people, even when there's no reason to think so. That's optimism bias, and it quietly colors your expectations without asking for permission. It's why you might assume you'll live longer than average, avoid serious illness, succeed in your career, or stay happily married, while thinking other people probably won't be as lucky. Even if you know the statistics, you believe you'll beat the odds. You believe your car won't get into an accident, your plans will go smoothly, and your future will unfold exactly as you imagined. This bias is part of what keeps people going. It fuels ambition, perseverance, and the willingness to take risks. If we saw reality with complete accuracy, we might be too paralyzed by uncertainty or fear to act. Optimism bias whispers in your ear, "You'll be fine." And sometimes that's exactly what you need to hear to move forward. But it also has a downside. It can lead to overconfidence, poor planning, and ignoring warning signs. You might underestimate how long a project will take, skip insurance, delay a health checkup, or avoid saving money, because somewhere in the back of your mind, you believe everything will just work itself out. Optimism bias isn't just about big life decisions either. It shows up in daily choices. I'll remember that without writing it down. This shortcut won't get me lost, or I probably won't get caught. It convinces you that you're the exception, that your good luck will continue indefinitely. That misfortune happens to other people. But here's the twist. Most people think this way. So, in a strange way, we're all being overly optimistic together, each of us assuming we're the lucky ones. And yet, many of us do make it through life relatively okay, in part because this bias helps us stay hopeful, resilient, and driven. The danger isn't optimism itself. It's unchecked optimism, optimism without preparation. Believing things will go well is powerful, but preparing in case they don't, that's wisdom. You tend to expect things to go worse than they probably will. That's pessimism bias, the tendency to overestimate the likelihood of negative outcomes and to see future events through a darker, more anxious lens than reality justifies. It makes you assume things will fall apart, that people will let you down, or that trying something new will end in failure. Even when there's no real reason to be so doubtful, your brain whispers, "It probably won't work out," just to be safe. This bias can come from past experiences, especially painful ones. If you've been disappointed before, your mind tries to protect you by preparing for the worst. But that protection often comes at a cost: missed opportunities, constant stress, and a skewed view of life. You might hesitate to apply for a job because you assume you won't get it. You might avoid relationships because you're convinced they'll eventually hurt. You might see the world as getting worse, even when certain things are statistically improving, like poverty, health, or violence, Because bad news feels more believable than good news. Pessimism bias doesn't just affect individuals. It shapes public opinion, politics, and culture. A single failure gets remembered more vividly than 10 quiet successes. Predictions about disaster grab more attention than slow, steady progress. The media knows this, which is why headlines lean negative. Fear spreads faster than hope. And once that outlook takes hold, it becomes self-reinforcing. If you expect the worst, you might stop trying, and by stopping, you make failure more likely, fulfilling the very fear you started with. But here's what makes this bias so tricky. It feels like realism. It feels smart to assume things will go wrong. After all, life can be hard. But pessimism bias isn't realism. It's a distorted filter that makes you underestimate your chances, underrate the goodness in the world, and overlook your own resilience. Being cautious is wise, but expecting the worst all the time? That's just another illusion. You remember something one way, but it turns out it never happened like that. And somehow, a whole bunch of other people remember it the same wrong way. That's the Mandela Effect. It gets its name from a strange moment when many people swore they remembered Nelson Mandela dying in prison in the 1980s, even though he actually lived until 2013. It wasn't just a vague memory. They remembered news coverage, public mourning, even school lessons about it. But none of it ever happened, and it doesn't stop there. Maybe you remember the Monopoly man having a monocle. He doesn't. Or maybe you're sure Darth Vader said, "Luke, I am your father." But the actual line is just, "No, I am your father." These aren't just typos or slip-ups. They're full, confident memories of something that never existed, often shared by thousands or even millions of people. What makes the Mandela Effect so fascinating is that it challenges your sense of how solid and reliable memory is. It feels like your memory is a video recording you can rewind and play back. But it's not. Memory is more like a story your brain recreates each time you recall it, filling in gaps, making assumptions, smoothing over details. And because human brains tend to work in similar ways, they often make the same mistakes. The result? Collective false memories that feel absolutely real. Some people even take it further, wondering if these glitches are evidence of alternate realities, parallel timelines, or shifts in the fabric of the universe. Whether or not you believe that, the Mandela Effect is a reminder that even your most vivid memories aren't immune to distortion. You can be completely confident in something that simply never happened, and you won't be alone. You remember something clearly, so clearly that you'd bet money on it, but it turns out you're wrong about where the memory came from. That's misattribution of memory. It happens when your brain mixes up the details. You remember the fact, the face, or the event, but attach it to the wrong time, place, or person. You might confidently tell a story that you think happened to you when it actually happened to someone else. Or recall a great idea you had, not realizing you actually heard it from a friend or read it in a book years ago. What makes this bias so powerful is that it doesn't feel like a glitch. The memory feels just as real as your true ones. Your brain fills in the blanks without asking your permission, stitching fragments of experiences together into a story that feels right, even if it isn't. You might swear you saw a certain movie as a kid, but the movie came out when you were already an adult. You might remember a conversation that never happened, simply because you've imagined it so vividly. Misattribution can even make eyewitness testimony dangerously unreliable. Someone might genuinely believe they saw a person at the scene of a crime, when what they really saw was that person's photo on TV the day before. The brain is not a recording device, it's a storyteller. And like any storyteller, it gets creative. It borrows pieces from dreams, books, overheard conversations, emotions, and assumptions, weaving them into a tapestry of what we call memory. Misattribution is a reminder that even our most cherished, most vivid memories aren't immune to error. They're reconstructions, not replays. And that means every time we remember something, we're not just accessing the past, we're also slightly rewriting it. If you want to remember something for a long time, studying it once isn't enough. And strangely, repeating it over and over again in a single sitting isn't the best strategy either. What actually works better is spacing it out, revisiting the material over time with breaks in between. This is known as the spacing effect, and it's one of the most reliable findings in cognitive psychology. Your brain doesn't just remember based on repetition. It remembers based on how that repetition is timed. When you cram, your brain holds the information in short-term memory, just long enough to pass a test or finish a task. But without space between learning sessions, there's no need for your brain to encode it deeply. It treats the information like something disposable. But when you return to the same idea after a delay, after your brain has almost started to forget, it has to work a little harder to retrieve it. And that effort strengthens the memory. The more times you retrieve it, with longer gaps between each attempt, the more solidly it gets locked into long-term memory. It's counterintuitive because spacing your learning feels slower. You might forget a bit between sessions, and that feels like failure. But that forgetting is part of the process. It forces your brain to re-engage, to rewire, to restore the idea more deeply. That's why learning a new language, mastering a skill, or studying for something meaningful works best when spread out across days, weeks, or even months. You could study for 5 hours today and remember almost nothing a week from now. Or you could study for 1 hour a day over 5 days and remember it for life. The spacing effect teaches us that learning isn't just about effort, it's about timing. The brain learns best not when it's flooded with information, but when it's gently reminded again and again just before it forgets. When you look back on an experience, you don't remember the whole thing equally. You remember how it felt at its peak and how it ended. That's the peak-end rule. Your brain doesn't take the average of every moment. It zooms in on the most intense part and the final part, and uses those two moments to judge the entire event. That's why a vacation with one magical evening can feel amazing in retrospect, even if most of the trip was just okay. It's also why a good movie with a disappointing ending can feel like a bad movie overall, even if most of it was enjoyable. This rule shapes how we remember relationships, jobs, meals, concerts, almost anything with a beginning, middle, and end. A painful experience, like a medical procedure, can be remembered as less unpleasant if the final moments were gentle, even if the overall pain was worse. Likewise, a party that drags on too long can leave a sour taste, even if most of it was fun. Our memories aren't fair. They're highlight reels with biased editing. We forget the boring middle parts and exaggerate the emotional highs or lows. And this doesn't just affect how we remember things. It affects the choices we make in the future. You might return to a restaurant because of one incredible dessert, even if the rest of the meal was mediocre. Or you might avoid something entirely because of how badly it ended, even if it was mostly good. The peak-end rule teaches us that memory and experience are not the same. What we live through and what we carry forward are different, and sometimes all it takes to change how something is remembered is one powerful moment or a better ending. You remember exactly where you were, what you were doing, who you were with. The moment something shocking happened, good or bad, it burned itself into your mind like a photograph. That's what's known as a flashbulb memory. These are vivid, emotionally charged memories that feel like they've been permanently seared into your brain. People often describe them with total confidence. I remember every detail, they say, as if it happened yesterday. The day a loved one passed, the moment they heard world-changing news, the instant they fell in love or felt their heart break. It's like time froze, and their memory captured the scene forever. But here's the twist. While these memories feel crystal clear, they're often wrong. Studies show that over time, people's flashbulb memories shift and distort, even though their confidence in them stays high. The brain doesn't actually store memories like photographs. It reconstructs them, piece by piece, every time you recall them. That means each time you revisit that intense moment, your brain might slightly reshape it without you realizing. You're not just remembering, you're rewriting. So, why do flashbulb memories feel so real? Because emotion supercharges memory. When something feels huge, your brain throws all its attention at it. But attention isn't accuracy. It just means that moment gets tagged as important. You remember the emotion with clarity, the shock, the fear, the joy, but the facts? Not so much. Your mind fills in gaps with guesses, with assumptions, or with pieces borrowed from other memories. Flashbulb memories are a reminder that certainty and truth aren't always the same. You might feel sure, but that doesn't mean your memory is faithful, and yet, these memories often shape who we are, how we see the world, and how we tell our story. They're emotional landmarks in the landscape of your life, even if the map isn't exactly right. You tend to remember the past as better than it actually was. That's rosy retrospection, a bias where your mind smooths over the rough parts of old experiences and highlights the good ones. You look back at your high school years and forget the awkwardness, the anxiety, the boring classes, and instead remember the laughs, the friends, the feeling of possibility. A vacation that felt exhausting at the time becomes, in your memory, relaxing and magical. A relationship that ended for good reasons starts to seem, in hindsight, like something you lost rather than escaped. This isn't just nostalgia, it's a kind of mental editing. Your brain doesn't store events like a camera. It stores impressions, emotions, highlights. And when you look back, especially when life feels uncertain or stressful in the present, your mind unconsciously reaches for comforting memories. The past starts to feel like a golden age, even if it was full of the same struggles, doubts, and frustrations you're dealing with now. The further away in time an experience gets, the easier it is for the negatives to fade and for the positives to glow brighter. This bias can make the present feel worse by comparison. You might wonder why life feels harder now, or why things seemed simpler back then. But it's not always because things were actually better. It's often because the memory has been edited to feel that way. The danger of rosy retrospection is that it can keep you stuck, chasing a past that never really existed the way you remember it. But it also has a hidden upside. It helps you heal. Even painful times can be remembered fondly once the sharp edges are worn down. In a way, rosy retrospection is your mind's way of giving closure, a gentle rewrite that helps you keep going. You misjudge when things happened, thinking recent events were farther back in time, and distant ones were more recent than they actually were. This is the telescoping effect, and it quietly distorts your memory like a time lens that's just slightly out of focus. You might feel like your last vacation was just a few months ago, even though it was over a year ago. Or you might place your high school graduation closer to childhood than it really is, even if it's been decades. Your brain compresses and stretches time in ways that don't match the calendar. What's interesting is that this distortion isn't random. Events that are emotionally vivid or significant tend to feel more recent, even if they happened a long time ago. Meanwhile, routine or forgettable things often slide backward in your mind and seem farther away. You might feel like a major breakup happened yesterday because it still stings, while last month's work meetings already feel like a distant blur. This effect shows up in research too. When people are asked when they last visited a doctor, saw a movie, or attended an event, they almost always get it wrong. They pull past events forward and push recent ones back without realizing it. The more familiar an event is, the more likely you are to misplace it on your mental timeline. It's like your memory isn't built on actual dates, but on impressions, feelings, and mental shortcuts. Part of this has to do with how your brain organizes time. You don't carry a perfect mental calendar. Instead, you rely on cues, context, and your emotional connection to the memory. If those cues are strong, the event feels closer. If they're weak, it drifts away, even if it wasn't that long ago. The result is a distorted sense of your own life story, where moments appear and disappear based not on reality, but on relevance, emotion, and repetition. The telescoping effect is a quiet reminder that your experience of time is deeply subjective. You live in a timeline of feeling, not just fact, and while clocks measure time in seconds and minutes, your memory measures it in meaning. You think speeding up a little will save you a lot of time, but it won't. That's the time-saving bias, a mental shortcut that makes you overestimate how much time you'll save by going faster, especially when you're already moving at a decent speed. For example, if you're driving 30 miles per hour and you increase to 60, you save a lot of time. But if you're already going 60 and bump it up to 70, the time saved is actually small, yet it feels huge. Your brain doesn't naturally grasp how time and speed interact in non-linear ways, so it gives you the illusion that faster always means drastically better. This bias doesn't just show up in traffic, it plays tricks on you in your everyday decisions, like how long it takes to complete tasks when you try to hustle through them. You might assume that working a bit faster or cutting a few corners will shave off big chunks of time, when in reality, the gains are often minimal and can even backfire if they lead to mistakes or stress. It's why people choose high-speed internet plans they don't need, or cram their schedules assuming they'll squeeze in extra productivity, only to feel rushed and scattered. The time-saving bias also explains why we sometimes take unnecessary risks just to save time, like running red lights, skipping steps in a process, or multitasking when focus would be faster in the long run. It makes us impatient with slower but more consistent strategies and overly optimistic about shortcuts. And yet, over a lifetime, it can shape your priorities, habits, and even your health. Because chasing small, imagined gains often cost you more than it gives. Ironically, when you slow down just enough to think clearly, you often get where you're going faster. But that moment of reflection, the one that breaks the illusion, is exactly what the time-saving bias tries to rush you past. Your brain doesn't like loose ends. When you start something and don't finish it, your mind keeps circling back to it, holding on to the tension until it's resolved. This is known as the Zeigarnik Effect. It's why you can't stop thinking about that email you meant to send, the project you left halfway done, or even a cliffhanger at the end of a TV episode. Unfinished tasks take up mental space. They stay active in your mind much longer than the ones you've completed. This effect was first noticed when a psychologist saw that waiters could remember unpaid orders with perfect accuracy, but forgot them almost immediately after the bill was settled. The incomplete nature of the task kept it alive in their memory. And it's not just waiters. Your brain works the same way. The Zeigarnik effect keeps unresolved items at the forefront of your mind, almost like a background process running until it gets to finish what it started. It's part of why procrastination feels so heavy. You tell yourself you're relaxing, but the thing you're putting off keeps tugging at your attention, draining energy in the background. It's also why making a to-do list helps. You're offloading those open loops onto paper, freeing your mind from holding onto them all at once. Even small tasks, like replying to a text or finishing a conversation, can quietly nag at you until they're done. Marketers use this effect too. Ever notice how quizzes make you answer all but one question, then ask for your email to see the results? That tension, of almost finishing, compels you to follow through. Writers use it by ending chapters on cliffhangers. Games use it with achievements that feel just out of reach. The Zeigarnik effect turns incompleteness into psychological gravity. It pulls your attention back again and again, not because you want it to, but because your mind craves closure. Your brain doesn't treat every piece of information equally. When you hear a list of things, you're most likely to remember the very first ones and the very last ones, and forget most of what's in the middle. This is the serial position effect, and it quietly shapes what you remember and what you forget. The beginning sticks because it's what you heard first. You had time to focus on it, think about it, and commit it to memory. That's called the Primacy Effect. The end sticks because it's still fresh in your mind, maybe just seconds old. That's the Recency Effect. But the stuff in between, it often just fades away. This doesn't just happen with lists. Think about meeting a group of people at a party. You're more likely to remember the first person you talked to and the last, and struggle to recall the names of everyone else in the middle. In presentations, speeches, or arguments, what's said at the start and at the end has the most impact. Politicians, advertisers, and public speakers know this, which is why they put their strongest points at the beginning and end, because that's what you'll take away. Even when studying or reading, this effect shows up. If you're going through flashcards, you'll probably do better with the first few and last few than anything in between. That's why breaking study sessions into smaller chunks, so there are more beginnings and ends, can actually help you retain more. The serial position effect reveals that memory isn't a smooth recording. It's more like a spotlight, bright at the edges and dim in the middle. It's one of those quirks of the human mind that shapes our choices, our conversations, and even our relationships without us ever noticing it's there. The more you see something, the more you tend to like it, even if you don't fully understand why. That's the mere exposure effect. It's a quiet force in your brain that equates familiarity with comfort and comfort with goodness. You might hear a song on the radio and feel indifferent at first, but after the 5th or 10th time, it starts to grow on you. It's not necessarily because the song got better, it's because your brain has stopped treating it as unfamiliar, and that makes it feel safer, easier, even enjoyable. This effect doesn't just work with music. It happens with faces, brands, foods, ideas, even words. Advertisers rely on it constantly. They don't need you to fall in love with a product the first time you see it. They just need you to see it enough times that When the moment comes to make a decision, it feels like the familiar choice. And when something feels familiar, it feels right, even if you've never really thought about it. The mere exposure effect can shape your relationships too. People you see regularly, classmates, coworkers, neighbors, start to seem more likable over time, not necessarily because of who they are, but simply because they've become part of your visual and social landscape. This is one reason why long-distance friendships or one-off interactions often fade. The connection lacks that repeated exposure that helps feelings grow. The most interesting part? This bias doesn't even need your awareness. You can grow to prefer symbols, sounds, or images you barely noticed the first time. Your conscious mind may not care, but your subconscious is always counting how many times you've seen something. And it doesn't just make things seem better, it makes unfamiliar things seem worse. That's why new ideas or unfamiliar faces can trigger discomfort at first. Your brain hasn't had time to warm up to them. In a world flooded with content, repetition is power. What you're exposed to most becomes what you feel comfortable with. And what you feel comfortable with can slowly become what you trust, believe in, and even love, without ever realizing how little it had to do with quality, and how much it had to do with simply showing up again and again. Sometimes being part of a group feels so good, so safe, so united, that you stop thinking for yourself, and that's groupthink. It's when the desire for harmony and agreement within a group becomes more important than making the best decision. You don't want to be the one who disagrees, who slows things down, who rocks the boat. So, you stay quiet. You nod along. You convince yourself that if everyone else is on board, they must be right. But that silence isn't agreement. It's fear of standing out. Groupthink can happen in boardrooms, governments, classrooms, friend groups, even online communities. It's why teams launch bad products, why juries make bad calls, why countries go to war without asking enough questions. Dissent feels dangerous, so it gets shut down, sometimes without anyone even realizing it. People begin censoring their doubts, avoiding conflict, and rallying around an illusion of consensus. And once that illusion takes hold, it becomes harder and harder for anyone to speak up. Because now, disagreeing doesn't just mean having a different opinion. It means threatening the unity of the group. What's eerie about groupthink is that the people involved are often smart, thoughtful, well-intentioned, but together they can become blind. Warnings are ignored, risks are downplayed, alternative ideas vanish. Everyone starts echoing each other, and the group moves forward with false confidence, convinced that silence equals support. Groupthink isn't just about peer pressure, it's about a subtle erosion of critical thinking in the name of belonging. The group starts to feel more important than the truth. But disagreement isn't disloyalty, and the best decisions often come from tension, friction, even uncomfortable questions. When everyone agrees too easily, it's not a sign that everything is perfect. It might be a sign that no one feels safe telling the truth. You want to be seen in a good light. Whether you realize it or not, you adjust your answers, your opinions, and sometimes even your memories to make yourself look better in the eyes of others. That's social desirability bias. It shows up when you tell a survey you exercise 3 times a week, even if you don't. It's why you say you recycle more than you actually do, or that you've never told a serious lie. In job interviews, you describe yourself as a team player, even if you prefer working alone. On social media, you post the version of yourself that feels the most acceptable. You're not lying exactly, you're performing. You're curating a version of you that aligns with what society rewards, even if it's not the full truth. This bias isn't about deception in the way we usually think of it. It's about survival in a world where judgment is everywhere. We live in a culture of constant observation, ratings, reviews, likes, cameras, opinions, and we've adapted by smoothing out the parts of ourselves that might draw criticism. We emphasize our compassion, our discipline, our virtue, and slowly we start believing our own edited versions. But the cost of social desirability bias is that it makes real honesty feel risky. It makes everyone look more confident, more kind, more consistent than they actually are, and that can leave you feeling isolated in your imperfections. You might think, everyone else seems to have it together. Why don't I? The truth is, most people are hiding the same doubts, the same mistakes, the same contradictions. But you don't see those. You just see the performance. And so, The cycle continues, everyone pretending for everyone else. Social desirability bias isn't just about making yourself look good. It's about protecting your place in the tribe. But, ironically, it can keep you from the very thing you want most, to be understood for who you really are. You naturally trust people who are part of your group more than those who aren't, even if the group is random, meaningless, or just barely defined. That's in-group bias, and it's one of the most basic yet powerful forces shaping how we see others. It can be based on anything: nationality, race, religion, sports team, political party, or even something as simple as which school you went to. Once you identify with a group, you tend to see its members as more trustworthy, more intelligent, more moral, and more deserving, often without even realizing it. It starts early. Kids assigned to wear red shirts in a classroom will start favoring other red shirt kids. In experiments, adults will show bias toward people who share their birthday, their taste in art, or even just a made-up team name. It doesn't take much. Once the line is drawn between us and them, your brain starts to unconsciously defend your side. You forgive mistakes more easily, explain away bad behavior, and give the benefit of the doubt to those in your group. But for outsiders, you're more likely to assume the worst. In-group bias isn't just about how we treat others. It also distorts how we understand fairness. You might think you're being objective, but when someone from your group succeeds, you see it as well-earned. When someone from another group does the same, you might feel suspicious or critical. This bias fuels tribalism, partisanship, and conflict. It makes it harder to collaborate across lines, to empathize with people who are different, and to see the full humanity in someone who doesn't belong to your us. What's wild is that even knowing about in-group bias doesn't fully protect you from it. It's deep, automatic, and often invisible, like a lens over your vision. The challenge is to become aware of how often we favor our own, and how easily that favoritism turns into exclusion, dismissal, or even hatred. True fairness means being able to see beyond the groups we're born into or identify with, and to recognize that they are just as complex, valuable, and real as us. You tend to think people in your own group are all unique individuals with different personalities, beliefs, and backgrounds, but people in other groups, they're all the same. That's outgroup homogeneity bias, and it's one of the most common mental shortcuts your brain takes. It's the belief that they are all alike, while we are diverse and complex. You might notice it when you describe people from a different culture, political party, religion, or even fandom as being one-dimensional. They're all extreme. They all believe that nonsense, or they all act the same. Meanwhile, you'd never say that about your own group, even if you disagree with some of its members. This bias comes from how your brain processes social information. You spend more time interacting with and understanding your own group, so you notice subtle differences. But with the outgroup, you don't have as much exposure or motivation to look deeper, so everyone blends together. You create categories, and once someone's placed in one, they become a symbol of the whole group rather than a person. It's especially powerful in moments of conflict or fear. If someone from an outgroup does something wrong, your mind turns it into a pattern. They're all like that. But when someone from your in-group does the same thing, it's an exception. They were having a bad day. They don't represent the rest of us. This double standard feeds stereotypes, fuels prejudice, and makes it harder to see individuals as they really are. What's dangerous is that outgroup homogeneity bias feels natural. It makes the world easier to navigate by simplifying people into neat boxes. But that simplicity comes at a cost. Empathy disappears, curiosity shuts down, and communication breaks apart. You stop seeing people, you just see labels. The truth is, every group is made up of complicated, diverse, contradictory individuals, just like your own. And when you start to look past the surface, you realize that the line between us and them isn't as thick as it seems. Something strange happens when a lot of people see the same emergency. No one helps. You might think that if more people are around, there's a better chance someone will step in. But in reality, it often works the opposite way. This is the bystander effect. The more people there are, the less responsible each individual feels. Everyone assumes someone else will do something, so no one does. You might see someone collapse on a crowded street. Dozens of people walk by. You wait, thinking, someone's probably already called for help. but everyone else is thinking the same thing. The responsibility gets diluted. It doesn't feel like your problem. It feels like someone else's problem. Ironically, if you were the only person there, you'd probably act right away. But in a crowd, action feels less urgent, less personal. That pause, that hesitation, can cost time, and sometimes lives. This effect isn't limited to dramatic emergencies. It shows up in everyday situations too. A classmate is being bullied, and everyone stays quiet. A coworker makes an inappropriate comment, and the room freezes. Silence spreads, not because people agree, but because no one wants to be the first to speak. The fear of embarrassment, of standing out, or of doing the wrong thing is stronger when others are watching. So, we wait, we watch, we assume. But the bystander effect isn't a rule, it's a tendency. And once you know about it, you can push against it. The next time you see something wrong and feel that urge to stay quiet, remember, everyone else might be waiting for you. Sometimes all it takes is one person to act, to speak, to help, to break the silence, and the whole group shifts. The illusion that someone else will do it vanishes, and suddenly the responsibility is real and shared. You go along with the group not because you agree, but because you don't want to stand out. That's normative conformity, the pull to fit in, even when it means ignoring what you really think or feel. Maybe you're at a meeting and everyone nods along with an idea you think is flawed. But instead of speaking up, you stay silent because it feels safer. Maybe you're with friends and someone makes a joke you find offensive, but you laugh anyway because you don't want to be the one who kills the vibe. The group's approval becomes more important than your own judgment. This bias doesn't just affect people who are unsure of themselves. It affects everyone. Studies show that even when people know the right answer, they'll often go along with the wrong one if enough people around them agree. The discomfort of being the odd one out can override logic, evidence, even values. And the more unanimous the group seems, the stronger the pressure becomes. You start to doubt yourself. Maybe I missed something. Maybe they know better. Or worse, you stop caring whether you're right and just care about not being rejected. Normative conformity helps hold groups together, but it can also lead to bad decisions, groupthink, and silence in the face of injustice. It explains why people follow trends they don't like, agree with opinions they secretly oppose, and sometimes live lives that feel out of sync with who they really are. The more we rely on others for our sense of right and wrong, the more fragile our sense of self becomes. But recognizing this bias is powerful. It lets you pause and ask, am I agreeing because I believe this, or because I don't want to be alone? And that question, that quiet moment of honesty, is often the first step away from the crowd and back toward your own voice. You probably think your best qualities are rarer than they actually are. That's the false uniqueness effect, a bias that makes you believe your talents, values, and achievements are more exceptional than most people's. If you're generous, you might assume most people aren't. If you value honesty, you might feel like you're one of the few who really live by it. If you've done something kind or creative, you might think, not many people would have done that. This bias feeds your sense of individuality, reinforcing the idea that you're somehow special. Not just in a generic way, but uniquely moral, uniquely talented, uniquely insightful. It's comforting, and in some ways, motivating. Believing you're different from the crowd can give you a sense of purpose and identity. But it also quietly distorts your understanding of others. You might underestimate how many people share your struggles, your values, or your experiences. You might feel isolated when in fact you're not. It can even lead to frustration, like when you think you're the only one working hard or being honest in a group, and wonder why everyone else doesn't seem to care as much. This bias doesn't just show up in your self-image, it affects how you judge others. If you believe you're unusually compassionate, you might be quicker to see others as cold or selfish. If you think you're especially open-minded, you might dismiss those who disagree with you as rigid or ignorant. The irony is, many people think this way, which means the belief that you're uniquely good, thoughtful, or capable is actually quite common. At its core, the false uniqueness effect reveals something interesting about the human mind. We all want to feel distinct, valuable, irreplaceable. And while that desire isn't wrong, it becomes a distortion when it blinds us to the simple truth that other people, quietly and invisibly, often share the same goodness we think is rare. You might be sitting in a room where everyone is thinking the same thing, but no one says it because each person assumes they're the only one thinking it. That's pluralistic ignorance. It's when everyone in a group privately disagrees with something, but goes along with it because they believe everyone else supports it. So nobody speaks up, and the silence is mistaken for consensus. This creates a powerful illusion that the group believes something it doesn't actually believe. You've probably experienced it without realizing. Maybe in class, the teacher asked if anyone had questions and you were confused, but didn't raise your hand because no one else did. You thought, I must be the only one who doesn't get it. But what if everyone else was thinking the same thing? Or imagine a group of friends joking about something offensive. No one laughs genuinely, but everyone pretends to, assuming they're the only one who's uncomfortable. So the joke keeps going. Everyone's waiting for someone else to break the illusion, but no one wants to be the first. This bias shows up in schools, workplaces, families, even entire societies. People act in ways they don't agree with because they believe they're alone in their doubt. It explains how harmful norms persist, not because people truly believe in them, but because they falsely believe everyone else does. And when you believe you're the only one who thinks differently, you stay quiet, and the cycle continues. Pluralistic ignorance thrives in silence. It's not just a failure of honesty, it's a failure of visibility. Everyone is hiding behind everyone else's mask. The only way out is through vulnerability. Someone has to say what they're actually thinking. And often, when that happens, it cracks the illusion. Others speak up, the pressure lifts, and you realize you weren't alone at all. You were just part of a group of people who all thought they were. You underestimate how much your emotions control you, and you do the same to everyone else. That's the empathy gap. It's the mental blind spot that makes it hard to understand how powerful emotions really are when you're not currently feeling them. When you're calm, you might say, I'd never lose my temper over something like that, or I'd never cave in to temptation. But then the moment you're angry or overwhelmed or exhausted, everything changes. Suddenly, the thing you swore you'd never do feels inevitable, even justified. The empathy gap also works in reverse. When you're upset, it's hard to imagine how you'll ever feel okay again. A heartbreak feels permanent. Anxiety feels like the truth. You forget that emotions shift, that your mind will return to center. It's like being stuck inside a storm and forgetting that blue sky even exists. This bias doesn't just affect how you view yourself. It deeply distorts how you judge others. When someone else breaks down, lashes out, or makes a bad decision, it's easy to think they're irrational or weak. You forget what it feels like to be in that state. You might say, they should have just stayed calm, as if calmness is always available. But in the grip of strong emotion, reason doesn't stand a chance. People don't always need advice. They need understanding. And empathy gap blocks that understanding. It's one of the reasons we struggle with compassion, why we give shallow advice, why we fail to prepare for how hard things will really be. We make plans when we're at our best and forget to account for our worst. We tell ourselves we'll stick to the diet, stay patient with loved ones, be the bigger person. And then we're surprised when we don't. The empathy gap is like a time travel glitch in your brain. It can't quite imagine who you'll be in a different emotional state, even if that version of you is only a few minutes away. The more you're aware of it, the more forgiving you become, of your past self, of your future self, of other people who are just as tangled in their own storms. You're more likely to accept an argument if the conclusion feels right to you, even if the logic that leads to it is flawed. That's belief bias. It's the mental shortcut, where we judge the strength of reasoning not by how valid it is, but by whether we already agree with the outcome. If someone says something that matches what you already believe, you'll probably nod along, even if their reasoning is full of holes. But if the conclusion feels wrong, if it challenges your worldview, you'll start picking apart the argument, even if it's logically airtight. This bias shows up everywhere: politics, religion, social issues, even in casual debates with friends. If someone you agree with makes a bad argument, you might not notice, or you'll excuse it. But if someone you disagree with makes a strong case, your brain might go into defense mode. Belief bias isn't about being irrational on purpose. It's about how deeply our existing beliefs shape the way we evaluate information. It's like putting on tinted glasses. You can still see, but everything's colored by what you already believe. Over time, this creates echo chambers where people stop listening to reasoning and just chase arguments that feel right. It's part of why debates rarely change minds. It's not enough to be logically correct. You have to overcome the emotional filter people use to process logic in the first place. Belief bias shows us how reason and belief aren't always on the same team. And unless we actively question ourselves, we end up confusing what makes sense with what we simply want to be true. You naturally defend your own point of view, even when the evidence is shaky or when you're wrong. And that's my side bias. It's the mental reflex that makes you instantly protective of your beliefs, your opinions, your team, your identity. When you hear an argument that supports your side, you're more likely to accept it without question. When you hear an argument from the other side, your brain kicks into high gear, not to understand it, but to dismantle it. You look for flaws, inconsistencies, and anything that lets you dismiss it, even if it makes good points. This isn't about intelligence. In fact, studies show that smarter people are often better at rationalizing their own views. They use their brainpower not to seek truth, but to build stronger walls around what they already believe. And because it feels like you're thinking critically, it's easy to mistake my side bias for careful reasoning. But really, you're being a mental lawyer, not a judge. You argue for your side, not weigh both sides fairly. My side bias shows up everywhere. Politics, religion, social debates, science discussions, even arguments over which phone brand is better. It's why debates so often turn into shouting matches. Both sides think they are being logical, when really, both are just defending their turf. And it doesn't stop with arguments. You're more likely to notice data that supports your beliefs, remember stories that back you up, and surround yourself with people who agree with you. That makes your viewpoint feel more obvious and more correct, because everyone around you sees the world the same way. It's a self-reinforcing loop. The danger is that my side bias can trap you in a bubble. It makes you less curious, less empathetic, and less likely to grow. But the moment you realize you're doing it, that knee-jerk need to be right, you can take a step back. You can ask, what if I'm wrong? Or, how would this sound if it came from my own side? That shift, that little bit of humility, is what turns a closed mind into an open one. And in a world full of loud opinions, an open mind is a rare and powerful thing. When you do something good, you might feel like you've earned the right to do something not so good right after. And that's the moral credential effect. It's a strange psychological loophole where past moral behavior gives you a kind of license to relax your standards. For example, if you donate to charity in the morning, you might feel more justified splurging on something wasteful in the afternoon. If you stand up for someone in one situation, you might feel less guilty about ignoring injustice later on. It's not that you've suddenly become less ethical. It's that your brain quietly tallies up your good person points and uses them as cover for questionable choices. This bias can show up in all kinds of subtle ways. A manager who prides themselves on hiring diversely might feel less pressure to consider equity when promoting someone. A person who identifies strongly with a cause might feel less need to check their own behavior because they're already on the right side. It's as if one good deed becomes a moral shield, letting us excuse actions we'd normally question in others. What's dangerous is that we rarely notice it happening. It feels like balance or fairness, when really it's self-deception dressed up as virtue. And the more we identify with being a good person, the more vulnerable we are to it. The moment we start thinking we're above reproach is the moment we stop holding ourselves accountable. The moral credential effect reminds us that being ethical isn't a status you achieve. It's a practice you maintain. You don't get a lifetime pass for doing the right thing once. Real morality isn't a scoreboard. It's what you choose when no one's watching, when it's inconvenient, and when you don't have anything left to prove. You believe you're a good person, but then you do something that doesn't quite line up. Maybe you lie, maybe you cheat a little, maybe you hurt someone you care about. That uncomfortable tension you feel afterward, that nagging mental itch that something doesn't add up, is cognitive dissonance. It's what happens when your actions and your beliefs are in conflict, and your brain scrambles to close the gap. You might justify what you did by saying, everyone would have done the same, or it wasn't really a big deal, or they deserved it anyway. That's not just an excuse. It's your mind working overtime to protect your self-image. Cognitive dissonance isn't limited to morality. It shows up when someone who smokes knows it's harmful, but keeps smoking. Instead of quitting, they might downplay the risks or say things like, "My grandfather smoked and lived to 95. It happens when someone stays in a toxic relationship, but insists it's not that bad. or when people invest time, money, or emotion into something and then refuse to admit it was a mistake, because doing so would mean admitting they were wrong. And that hurts more than staying the course. This bias can twist logic in subtle ways. It can make people deny science that clashes with their worldview, defend beliefs they no longer fully agree with, or reject new ideas just because accepting them would mean rethinking years of assumptions. The mind wants consistency. It wants to see itself as rational, kind, and in control. So, when reality threatens that picture, the brain doesn't always change the behavior. It changes the story. Sometimes dissonance drives growth. Feeling uncomfortable can lead to reflection, change, and deeper honesty. But more often, it leads to rationalization, a patch job over a deeper conflict. We tell ourselves whatever we need to keep our internal world from falling apart, even if it means ignoring the truth. That's the power of cognitive dissonance. It doesn't just protect our beliefs, it protects who we think we are. You believe you see the world as it really is, as if your perceptions, beliefs, and judgments are simply reflections of objective reality. That's naive realism. It's the feeling that your viewpoint isn't just a viewpoint, but the truth, plain and obvious. And if other people see things differently, well, then they must be misinformed, irrational, biased, or just not paying attention. It's not that you think you're always right. It's that your version of reality feels so immediate and natural that it's hard to imagine how someone else could genuinely see it another way. This illusion starts early and runs deep. If you watch a political debate and someone makes a point that aligns with your beliefs, it sounds clear and reasonable. If the other side makes a counterpoint, it feels manipulative or wrong, even if it's structured the same way. You assume your judgments are based on evidence and logic, while others are swayed by emotion, propaganda, or ignorance. And yet, everyone else is thinking the same thing about you. Naive realism isn't just about politics or big issues. It's in everyday life too. A friend forgets to text back, and you assume they're being rude or distant. But from their point of view, they were just overwhelmed or distracted. Two people can look at the same situation and come away with completely different stories, each convinced that their version is the real one. That's the power of perspective, and the trap of forgetting we even have one. What makes naive realism dangerous is that it shuts down curiosity. If you think you already see things as they are, why bother listening to anyone else? Why ask questions, reflect, or explore other points of view? The truth is, everyone's perception is filtered by experiences, emotions, culture, memory, language. No one sees the world with perfect clarity. Recognizing that your view is just one lens among many doesn't make you weak. It makes you wise. Because once you accept that your perception is not the whole picture, you're finally in a position to start seeing more of it. You believe that because someone has had a streak of success, they're more likely to keep succeeding. That's the hot hand fallacy. It's the sense that momentum builds in a way that makes the next success feel almost inevitable. When someone nails a few tasks in a row, makes a series of smart decisions, or seems to be on a lucky streak, we assume they're in the zone and that the pattern will continue. But in reality, these streaks are often just coincidences, random clusters that we mistake for meaningful trends. This fallacy shows up in how we judge others and ourselves. If someone has made 3 good calls in a row, we start to believe they've unlocked a winning mindset, as if success itself is contagious. We overlook the possibility that chance, timing, or external factors played just as much of a role. And when the streak eventually ends, as most do, we feel surprised or confused because we thought the person had tapped into something special. We fall for the hot hand fallacy because our brains are wired to see patterns, even where none exist. It gives us a sense of control and predictability. It feels good to believe that success can build on itself like magic, and that we can ride the wave of a lucky moment just by noticing it. But in many situations, what looks like a hot hand is really just how randomness behaves. Sometimes things cluster together, and sometimes they don't. The key is resisting the urge to see streaks as signs of inevitability, and learning to separate real skill from the noise of chance. You hear a fact that contradicts what you believe, and instead of changing your mind, you dig in deeper. That's the backfire effect. It's one of the strangest quirks of the human mind. When your beliefs are challenged with evidence, not only do you often reject the new information, you become even more convinced you were right all along. You don't update your thinking, you fortify it, like adding more bricks to a mental wall. This happens because beliefs are not just ideas we hold. They're often part of who we are. They're connected to our identity, our values, our sense of belonging. So, when someone presents evidence that goes against your view, whether it's political, religious, or personal, it doesn't feel like a helpful correction. It feels like an attack, and your brain treats it that way. You get defensive, your reasoning becomes sharper, but not to evaluate the truth. It's aimed at protecting your existing view, no matter what. The backfire effect shows up in all kinds of places. A person who believes a conspiracy theory might reject 100 pieces of evidence against it, but cling to one piece that seems to support it. Someone with strong political views might read a fact check and come away more certain that the fact checkers are biased. And if you try to persuade someone with a calm, rational argument, they might not budge at all. In fact, they might leave the conversation more convinced you're wrong and they're right. The unsettling part is that the backfire effect doesn't just happen to other people. It happens to all of us. The smarter you are, the better you may be at rationalizing your beliefs instead of revising them. Intelligence becomes a tool for self-defense, not self-reflection. And because it feels like you're thinking critically, it's hard to tell that you're actually resisting truth. But there's hope. The backfire effect isn't unstoppable. It just needs the right conditions to soften. People are more open to change when they feel safe, when they don't feel judged, and when the challenge to their belief comes gently from someone they trust. Changing someone's mind, or your own, requires more than facts. It requires humility, empathy, and a willingness to let go of the need to always be right. When you believe something strongly enough, you start acting in ways that make it come true, whether you meant to or not. That's a self-fulfilling prophecy. It begins as an expectation, a prediction, or even just a feeling, but slowly, that thought shapes your behavior, and your behavior shapes reality. If you walk into a room believing people won't like you, you might avoid eye contact, keep your answers short, and come across as cold or uninterested. And what happens? People pull away, and you tell yourself, "See? I knew they wouldn't like me." The prophecy doesn't just reflect reality, it creates it. A teacher who believes a student is gifted may unknowingly give them more attention, more encouragement, more time to answer questions. That student feeling supported starts to perform better. The teacher was right, but only because they acted on that belief. It can go both ways, though. Expect someone to fail, treat them like a failure, and chances are they'll start believing it too. This happens in relationships, in school, at work, even with yourself. Tell yourself you're bad at public speaking, and you might never practice. You'll be more anxious when you try, and less confident when you speak. The outcome reinforces the belief, and the cycle repeats. It's not magic, it's psychology. Thoughts shape behavior, and behavior shapes outcomes. The strangest part? Self-fulfilling prophecies can feel like objective truths. We don't see how our beliefs influence our actions. We think we're just reacting to the world, not realizing we helped build the very thing we're reacting to. It's like writing the ending of a story while pretending you're just reading it. But here's the hopeful side. If negative expectations can trap you, positive ones can free you. If you believe you can improve, connect, grow, your actions will often follow, and reality may rise to meet that belief. The self-fulfilling prophecy is a powerful mental loop. The trick is becoming aware of it. So you're not just a character in the story, but the author too. You're biased, but one of the most stubborn biases of all is believing that you're not. That's blind spot bias. It's the tendency to see other people's thinking as flawed while assuming your own reasoning is fair, objective, and rational. You can spot confirmation bias in your friend's political argument, or notice when someone else is falling for a stereotype, but when it's your turn, you genuinely feel like you're just being logical. This creates a strange mental illusion. You become an expert at detecting bias in others while staying blind to it in yourself. It's not that you're lying or being fake, it's that your brain is protecting your self-image. Nobody likes to think of themselves as irrational. So even when you're making a decision based on emotion, impulse, or social pressure, your mind finds a way to justify it. You might think, "I'm just going with my gut," or "I've done the research," even if your conclusions are shaped more by personal beliefs than by facts. And when someone challenges you, your defenses go up. Not because you're stubborn, but because you truly don't see what they see. The real trap is that the smarter or more self-aware you are, the more likely you are to believe you've escaped bias, when in reality, you're just better at rationalizing it. The blind spot bias doesn't just affect individuals. It warps conversations, relationships, even entire societies. It makes debates go in circles. It's why people talk past each other, why apologies feel insincere, and why change is so hard. Everyone thinks they're the reasonable one, and the other side just doesn't get it. Admitting that you have a bias blind spot doesn't make you weak. It makes you wise. It's one of the hardest things to do, to stop assuming you're the exception to the rule. But when you do, something powerful happens. You begin to question your own assumptions. You listen more closely. You see your own thinking not as perfect, but as a work in progress. Sometimes, a choice that no one wants is put in front of you, not to be chosen, but to manipulate which other choice you do pick. That's the decoy effect. Imagine you're choosing between two options, a small popcorn for $3 or a large for $7. The price jump feels big, so you go for the small one. But now, imagine a third option is added, a medium popcorn for $6. Suddenly, the large one looks like a bargain, just $1 more for a big jump in size. And you choose it. But that medium size was never meant to sell. It was a decoy carefully designed to make the large seem like the smarter deal. This happens constantly, in restaurants, electronic stores, subscription services. Anytime someone wants to nudge your decision without making it feel forced. The decoy doesn't need to be appealing. It just needs to shift how you compare the real options. A low-tier gym membership with bad perks makes the mid-tier look reasonable. A terrible hotel room listing makes the slightly better one feel luxurious. Your mind stops thinking, do I need this? And starts thinking, which of these is the better value? And just like that, you've been guided, not by logic, but by comparison. The decoy effect is powerful because it works quietly. You feel like you're making a rational, informed decision, when really, the structure of the choices has already shaped the answer. It's not about what you want, it's about how your wants are steered. Once you notice it, you'll start to see decoys everywhere. Not just in prices, but in arguments, politics, even dating apps. A bad option placed in the right spot can change everything without ever being chosen. You assume that specific detailed scenarios are more likely than general ones, and that's the conjunction fallacy. It happens when your intuition tricks you into believing that adding more information makes something more probable, even though mathematically, it makes it less so. A classic example goes like this. You hear about Linda. She's described as outspoken, intelligent, deeply concerned with social justice, and active in protests. Then you're asked, which is more likely, that Linda is a bank teller, or that she's a bank teller and a feminist. Most people choose the second option, but logically, that can't be right. The probability of two things happening together is always less than or equal to the probability of just one of them happening. But the detailed description feels so right that it overrides logic. This fallacy shows up in everyday thinking all the time. You hear that someone is athletic and competitive, so you guess they're a personal trainer who also competes in triathlons, when really it's more likely they're just a personal trainer. The extra details make the story feel richer, more vivid, more believable. But more detail doesn't mean more truth, it just means more narrative. The conjunction fallacy feeds off the storytelling instinct in your brain. You want things to make sense, to be coherent. But coherence isn't the same as likelihood. Just because a story sounds right doesn't mean it is right. And this mistake doesn't just affect your opinions, it affects your decisions. You might overestimate risks because they include vivid details, or underestimate something simple because it seems too boring to be true. At its core, the conjunction fallacy reveals a tension between how we feel and how we reason. Your gut loves stories, your brain needs numbers, but unless you're careful, the story always wins. You flip a coin and it lands on heads 5 times in a row. You feel it in your gut. The next one has to be tails. It's due. It would be weird if it were heads again, but that feeling, as strong and convincing as it is completely wrong. That's the Monte Carlo fallacy, also known as the gambler's fallacy, the belief that past random events affect the outcome of future ones, even when each event is independent. It got its name from a real incident at the Monte Carlo casino in 1913. During a game of roulette, the ball landed on black 26 times in a row. People lost millions betting on red, believing that red was overdue, that it had to happen next. But roulette, like coin flips or dice rolls, has no memory. Each spin is its own isolated event, unaffected by what came before. The wheel doesn't care what happened last time. The fallacy shows up not just in gambling, but in everyday thinking. If you've failed a few job interviews in a row, you might feel like your luck has to turn around. If it's rained 5 days in a row, you might assume the next day will be sunny. We have this deep need to believe that the universe balances out in the short term, that randomness evens out quickly. But that's not how probability works. Patterns and streaks happen in randomness all the time. They're not signs, and they're not corrections. They're just the natural chaos of chance. The Monte Carlo fallacy tricks us because we expect fairness on demand. We want randomness to look tidy and balanced, but true randomness can look very unfair, very streaky, and very strange. That discomfort we feel when the same result happens over and over, that's the illusion talking. The world doesn't owe you a tails. You see a small pattern and jump to a big conclusion. That's the law of small numbers bias, the belief that a small amount of data can reveal the whole truth. If a new restaurant has 3 bad reviews, you might decide it's terrible. If you meet 2 people from a city who are rude, you might assume the whole city is like that. Your brain wants to find meaning fast, and it treats tiny samples as if they're statistically reliable, even when they're not. This bias comes from our deep discomfort with randomness. We want the world to make sense, to follow rules and trends we can spot quickly. But true randomness often includes streaks, clusters, or outliers that mean nothing. If you flip a coin 5 times and it lands on heads 4 times, the law of small numbers makes you feel like something suspicious is going on, like the coin is rigged, even though that's just how chance works. You expect small samples to behave like large ones, forgetting that patterns only stabilize with enough data. This isn't just a math problem, it affects real decisions. Investors might see a few weeks of rising stocks and assume a long-term trend. Doctors might rely on a few patient cases instead of wider studies. Politicians might change entire policies based on a few vocal complaints. The danger is that acting on too little information can lead to overconfidence, poor judgment, and decisions based more on anecdotes than reality. The truth is, small numbers lie all the time. That's not because people are wrong to notice patterns. It's because our brains evolved to be fast, not statistically precise. You instinctively prefer the idea of eliminating a small risk entirely over reducing a much bigger risk by a large amount, and that's called zero-risk bias. It feels more satisfying to wipe out one danger completely than to make a bigger threat a lot less dangerous, even if the second option would help you more in the long run. If 2 safety measures are presented, one that takes a minor risk from 1% to 0%, and another that takes a serious risk from 50% to 30%, many people will choose the first, even though the second one saves far more lives or prevents more harm. This bias shows up in everything from healthcare to public policy to personal decision-making. People will spend extra money on water filters that remove the last trace of a harmless chemical, while ignoring lifestyle changes that could dramatically cut their risk of heart disease or cancer. It's why some companies emphasize that their product eliminates 100% of germs. Even if that doesn't actually make you any safer than one that removes 99%. There's something deeply emotional about the number 0. It gives us a false sense of control, of finality, of complete safety. Zero-risk bias plays into our desire for closure. We don't just want to lower danger, we want to make it disappear. We're drawn to clean, absolute solutions, even if they aren't the most logical or efficient. But in reality, almost nothing is zero risk. Life is full of trade-offs, and seeking perfect safety in one area often blinds us to much bigger dangers elsewhere. Ironically, the obsession with eliminating tiny risks can make us overlook smarter choices that would protect us more overall. This bias also affects how we judge others. A person or company that fails to remove a small, visible risk may be criticized more than one that quietly tolerates bigger, hidden ones. Your brain struggles to feel the difference between a tragedy that affects a few and one that affects millions, and that's scope insensitivity. It's a cognitive glitch where numbers lose their emotional meaning once they get too large. You might feel deep compassion seeing a single photo of a starving child, but when told that thousands are suffering the same fate, the emotional impact doesn't increase. Sometimes it even decreases. It's not that you don't care, it's that your ability to care doesn't scale with the numbers. This bias makes it hard to make rational decisions about big issues. You might be willing to donate $50 to save one endangered bird, but hesitate to donate $100 to save 1,000. The math doesn't add up, but your emotions guide your judgment more than logic does. Your heart responds to vivid stories, not statistics. A single crying face moves you more than 1,000 nameless lives. Marketers, politicians, and charities understand this well. That's why they often focus on one relatable individual, not a sea of anonymous data. One victim, one face, one name, that's what breaks through. But the result is strange. Your concern may be deeply genuine, but it doesn't grow proportionally with the scale of the problem. You might feel just as upset about one lost dog as you do about an entire endangered species. Scope insensitivity also affects how we react to global issues like climate change, war, or poverty. We hear numbers, millions displaced, billions affected, but those figures become background noise. Our emotional systems evolve to care about the small and local, not the massive and abstract. So, the bigger the problem becomes, the more emotionally distant we feel. It's not a sign of apathy, it's a sign of being human. Our minds just aren't built to grasp the true weight of massive numbers. But understanding this illusion gives us a chance to act more deliberately, to make choices based not only on what feels urgent, but on what truly matters. You tend to avoid options that involve uncertainty, even when those options might be better. And that's the ambiguity effect in action. Imagine you're choosing between two restaurants. One has a long list of reviews, the other has none. Even if the second restaurant could be amazing, you're more likely to pick the first one, just because you know more about it. When details are missing, or when the outcome isn't crystal clear, your brain quietly leans away, not because it's logical, but because uncertainty feels uncomfortable. This bias shows up in decisions big and small. People often invest in familiar companies rather than new startups, even if the new ones have better potential. In medical choices, patients lean toward treatments with known risks, even when newer options with unknown probabilities could be more effective. In politics, voters stick with the candidate whose flaws are known, rather than take a chance on someone they don't fully understand. What's strange is that the unknown doesn't automatically mean bad. It just means we don't have enough information. But our minds don't like blanks. They treat ambiguity as danger, even when there's no reason to. So, we play it safe, not necessarily smart. The ambiguity effect is one of the reasons innovation gets resisted, why we hesitate to try new things, and why we sometimes stay stuck in situations that are familiar, but far from ideal. This bias protects us from risk, but it also shields us from opportunity. The next time you find yourself backing away from an option just because you're not sure about it, take a second look. That discomfort might not be a red flag. It might just be your brain being cautious in the face of mystery. And sometimes, the most worthwhile paths are the ones you can't fully see yet. When something feels safer, you often take more risks, and that's the paradox of risk compensation. It's the idea that when a situation becomes safer, people tend to behave less cautiously, offsetting some of the benefits of that safety. Picture a driver with anti-lock brakes and advanced airbags. Because they feel more protected, they may drive faster or brake later, unknowingly increasing the chance of a crash. The very thing designed to keep them safer gives them the confidence to take more chances. This behavior isn't limited to driving. Cyclists who wear helmets might weave through traffic more aggressively. People who use hand sanitizer regularly might touch their faces more often. Seatbelts, smoke alarms, sunscreen, even condoms. Any tool meant to reduce danger can lead to subtle shifts in how we behave, making us more comfortable with risk, simply because the fear is reduced. It's not that these safety measures are bad, they save lives, but they don't always make us as cautious as we think. The bias works on a subconscious level. You don't say, "I'm going to be reckless because I have a safety net." You just feel more relaxed and your behavior naturally shifts. In some cases, that shift is small. In others, it's dramatic enough to cancel out the benefit entirely. It's why some public health campaigns fail. People believe that because they've taken one precaution, they're covered, and then they stop worrying about all the other things they should still be careful about. Risk compensation reminds us that safety isn't just about the tools we use, it's about how we respond to those tools. Sometimes feeling safer can trick us into being less safe. You choose what feels good now, even if it means sacrificing something much better later. That's hyperbolic discounting, a bias that makes you value immediate rewards far more than future ones, even when waiting would clearly be smarter. It's why people procrastinate, overspend, skip workouts, and eat junk food. In the moment, the long-term goal feels distant and vague, while the short-term pleasure is right in front of you, vivid and tempting. You say you'll start the diet on Monday, save money next month, study tomorrow, but when the moment comes, the future loses again. This bias doesn't just affect small choices, it shapes entire lives. People underinvest in retirement, delay important health checkups, or stay in bad habits because the benefits of change take too long to show up. Hyperbolic discounting means that a reward loses value the further away it is in time. But the drop isn't gradual, it's steep. A reward today feels far more valuable than the same reward just a week from now. But if both rewards are far in the future, the bias disappears. You'd probably say you'd rather have $100 in 31 days than $90 in 30 days. But if it's $90 today or $100 tomorrow, most people take the $90. The strange part is, we're aware of it. We know we'll regret choosing the easier path later, but the bias still wins. That's why we make plans in advance to restrict our future behavior. We buy gym memberships, use timers, install productivity apps. Not to make better decisions in the moment, but to protect ourselves from our future selves. Hyperbolic discounting reveals a kind of internal time conflict. The person you are today has more power than the person you'll be tomorrow, even though they're both you. And that constant battle between short-term desire and long-term wisdom is one of the most human struggles there is. Sometimes things just go back to normal, and we mistake it for something we did. That's regression to the mean. Imagine a student who scores way below their usual average on a test. Next time, they score higher, and people say, "See, studying helped." Or an athlete has an amazing game, followed by a weaker one, and fans start speculating about injuries, pressure, or motivation. But what really happened? Just a swing back toward the average. Extreme highs and lows are often followed by more typical outcomes. Not because of any dramatic change, but because randomness tends to balance itself out. It's a natural statistical pattern, but we rarely see it that way. We look for causes because our brains are wired for stories, not probabilities. So, when someone has a streak of good luck and then hits a rough patch, we assume they lost their touch. When someone does badly, then does better, we credit a new strategy, a motivational speech, or a lucky charm. But often, what we're seeing is just noise smoothing out over time. This bias shows up everywhere, in business, sports, education, medicine. A patient tries a new treatment after a really bad week and starts to improve. But maybe they would have improved anyway. A company's stock plummets, then bounces back, and the CEO is praised for restoring confidence, when in fact, the fall and rise were both just part of normal volatility. What makes regression to the mean so deceptive is that it mimics cause and effect. It feels like someone or something must be responsible for the shift, because we crave reasons. But sometimes, the most honest explanation is the least satisfying one. It was just a return to average, no hero, no villain, no miracle. Just the quiet gravity of statistics, pulling things back toward the middle while we rush to invent a story. When you focus on something, it suddenly feels like the most important thing in the world, even if, in the bigger picture, it barely matters. That's the focusing illusion. It tricks your brain into magnifying whatever's right in front of you, making it seem like your entire happiness or well-being depends on it. If you're worried about money, it feels like more money would fix everything. If you're thinking about a relationship, it feels like that relationship is the key to your future. If you're annoyed about something small, traffic, a rude comment, a delayed flight, it can take over your entire emotional state, even if your life is going fine in every other area. The focusing illusion whispers, "This one thing is everything," and for a while, you believe it. But that belief isn't reality, it's a trick of attention. You can see this clearly in how people imagine their future. Someone might think, if I just get that job, then I'll be happy. Or, once I move to a better city, everything will fall into place. But after the job comes, or the move happens, life returns to normal. The mind shifts its focus to something else, and the cycle repeats. It's the same reason we overestimate how happy or unhappy major events will make us. Winning the lottery, getting married, experiencing loss, facing failure, none of these things affect our happiness as permanently as we expect. The mind adapts, but in the moment, whatever you're focusing on feels like the whole story. The focusing illusion is so powerful because it narrows your awareness. It blinds you to everything that's going well. It makes you forget your broader goals, your values, and even your physical surroundings. When you're caught in it, your thoughts shrink down to a single spotlight, and the rest of the stage fades to black. But here's the good news. If your mood can spiral from focusing too much on one problem, it can also improve when you deliberately shift your attention. Your mind is constantly creating reality by deciding what to emphasize. The focusing illusion reminds us that perspective isn't just a mental trick. It's the foundation of how we experience life. What you focus on becomes your world. Choose carefully. You tend to place more value on things just because they're yours, even if nothing else about them has changed. That's the endowment effect. If you're given a mug for free, and then someone offers to buy it from you a few minutes later, you'll probably want more money for it than you would have been willing to pay just 5 minutes earlier. It's not about the mug, it's about ownership. The moment something becomes yours, your brain attaches extra value to it, often irrationally. This shows up in all kinds of ways. You might overprice something you're trying to sell online because you've owned it for a while, even though buyers see it as just another used item. Or you might resist throwing away old clothes, gadgets, or furniture, not because you need them, but because you've had them for so long they feel like part of you. The same applies to ideas and beliefs. We become emotionally attached to our opinions simply because they're ours, and then defend them even when they don't hold up under scrutiny. The endowment effect reveals how deeply ownership shapes perception. What we possess becomes an extension of ourselves, and parting with it, even in theory, feels like a loss. That's why you might turn down a fair trade, or demand more to give something up than you would ever pay to get it. Economically, it doesn't make sense. Psychologically, it makes perfect sense. We don't just own things, we identify with them. And once something becomes mine, letting go feels like losing a piece of who we are. You tend to value something more just because you built it yourself, even if it's not that great. That's the IKEA effect, and it explains why assembling a wobbly bookshelf with your own hands somehow makes it feel like a masterpiece. It's not about the quality, it's about the effort. When you put time and energy into something, whether it's a project, a meal, or a relationship, your brain assigns it more worth simply because it's yours. Even if someone else could do it better, faster, or cleaner, it doesn't matter. It wouldn't feel the same. This effect goes way beyond furniture. It shows up in school projects, startup businesses, parenting, and creative work. You might write a song, paint a wall, or design a personal website that's objectively average, but because you made it, it feels special. You're emotionally invested, and that emotional investment can make you blind to flaws. It can lead to overconfidence, resistance to outside help, and the classic "my way is best" attitude, even when it clearly isn't. What's fascinating is that this bias taps into a deep part of what makes us human, the desire to create, to shape the world, and to leave a mark. We like to feel like something exists because of us, that our input matters. The IKEA effect gives us ownership, and with that ownership comes pride, but it also comes with a trap. You might cling to bad ideas just because they're yours, reject better alternatives, or get stuck defending something simply because you worked hard on it. At its best, the IKEA effect motivates you to care, to take initiative, and to finish what you start. At its worst, it locks you into attachments that don't serve you. Recognizing this bias doesn't mean you stop loving the things you build. It just means you can step back and ask, do I value this because it's good, or just because it's mine? And sometimes, that one question can make all the difference. After you make a decision, your brain starts working behind the scenes to convince you it was the right one, even if it wasn't. That's choice-supportive bias. It's the tendency to retroactively view our choices more favorably than they deserve, simply because we made them. Imagine you buy a new phone, and soon after you hear about another model that might have been better. Instead of admitting you might have chosen wrong, you start emphasizing everything great about your purchase. The camera's actually amazing. It feels sturdier. I don't even care about that other feature. Your mind shifts the story to make your choice seem smarter, more reasonable, even inevitable. This happens in relationships, careers, politics, everywhere. You date someone, and even if things are rocky, you find yourself defending them to your friends. Why? Because admitting you chose poorly feels like admitting a flaw in yourself. So you highlight their strengths and downplay the red flags. Or say you vote for a politician who later makes mistakes. Instead of changing your mind, you emphasize the positives, minimize the damage, or blame others. The bias isn't about facts. It's about preserving your sense of identity and competence. What makes choice-supportive bias especially sneaky is how it affects memory. Over time, we tend to forget the flaws of our chosen option and exaggerate the problems with the ones we didn't pick. It's like rewriting history to flatter our past selves. And while it can give us confidence and peace of mind, it can also trap us in bad decisions. We double down instead of learning. We rationalize instead of reflecting. But there's power in recognizing this pattern. You can still feel good about your choices while staying open to growth. Just because you chose something doesn't mean it was perfect. And admitting that doesn't make you weak, it makes you wiser. You think people can read you better than they actually can, that your emotions, intentions, and thoughts are more obvious than they really are. That's the illusion of transparency. When you're nervous during a speech, you assume everyone can tell. When you tell a white lie, you feel like your face is giving you away. When you're upset, you expect others to notice and ask what's wrong, but they often don't. You think your inner world leaks out, but to everyone else, you look mostly fine, neutral, calm, or unreadable. This illusion happens because your own emotions are so loud to you that it's hard to imagine they aren't just as loud to everyone else. If your heart is pounding, your palms are sweating, or you're replaying a mistake in your head, you assume the signals must be obvious. But the truth is, people are usually too focused on their own internal noise to notice yours. They're busy wondering what you think of them. The illusion of transparency creates a double misunderstanding. You overestimate how much people understand you, and you underestimate how much they're lost in their own minds. It also shows up in arguments and relationships. You might think you've made yourself clear, when in reality, the other person didn't pick up on your hints or your tone. You expect them to read between the lines, but they're not even reading the same page. This leads to frustration. Why don't they get it? Isn't it obvious? But it's not. Communication is messier than we like to admit. What feels clear on the inside can come out jumbled, subtle, or completely invisible. The illusion of transparency makes us more self-conscious than necessary, and more frustrated when others don't respond the way we expect. But once you realize it's just an illusion, that you're not as transparent as you feel, you can learn to speak a little more clearly, worry a little less about being judged, and understand that silence doesn't always mean someone knows what you're feeling. Most of the time, they don't. You tend to see yourself as the center of every situation, whether you mean to or not. That's egocentric bias, and it quietly colors how you interpret the world. When something goes wrong in a group project, you notice your own effort first. If someone seems upset, you might assume it's because of something you said. If the traffic is terrible or the line is long, it feels like the universe is personally inconveniencing you. You're not being selfish on purpose. It's just that your own thoughts, feelings, and experiences are the most vivid and accessible to you. You live inside your own head 24/7, and that perspective becomes your default lens. This bias can affect everything from your memory to your moral judgments. You're more likely to remember what you said in a conversation than what others said. You overestimate how much of a group's success or failure was due to your actions. You might feel like you're being super clear when explaining something because it makes sense in your mind, even if it doesn't land with others. And when people disagree with you, it's easy to think they're just not seeing things correctly, meaning your way. Egocentric bias also leads you to assume that others notice and think about you far more than they actually do. You might obsess over a small mistake or awkward moment, replaying it in your head, convinced that everyone else noticed it too. But chances are they didn't, even if they were in the same room. They were busy being the main characters in their own heads. What makes egocentric bias so sneaky is that it feels totally natural. Of course, your perspective seems most important. It's the one you experience directly. But stepping outside of it requires effort. It means actively imagining that other people have their own inner worlds just as rich and complex as yours, even if you can't see them. The more we can recognize this bias, the more we can open up to perspectives beyond our own. And in doing that, our world doesn't shrink, it expands. You remember things better when they relate to you personally. That's the self-reference effect. It's why, out of a list of random words, you're more likely to remember the one that connects to your own life, like pizza if it's your favorite food, or cat if you have one at home. Your brain is constantly filtering information, and one of the strongest signals it listens for is, does this have anything to do with me? This bias is why teachers ask students to apply lessons to their own experiences, and why advertisers frame products as part of your lifestyle. It's why you remember a fact better if you link it to your childhood, your favorite movie, or a personal story. Even the most mundane things can become memorable if they pass through the lens of your identity. A list of historical dates becomes more interesting if one of them is your birthday. A random statistic sticks in your mind if it reminds you of your hometown. But this effect goes deeper than memory. It shapes how you perceive the world. If something feels connected to you, it automatically feels more important. That's why people can get emotionally attached to the number on their sports jersey, or feel a weird connection to a hurricane just because it shares their name. It's also why personalized messages, like hearing your name in a crowded room, grab your attention instantly, even if you weren't listening to anything else. The self-reference effect reveals something simple but powerful. You are the anchor point for your own reality. Everything gets filtered through the story of you, and while that can help you learn, grow, and remember, it can also make it harder to truly see things from other perspectives. Because when everything is seen in terms of how it relates to you, it's easy to forget that most of the world doesn't revolve around your story. It's just passing through it. You're more likely to prefer things that share letters with your own name, especially the first letter, and you probably don't even realize it. That's the name letter effect. A subtle bias that makes us gravitate toward words, brands, places, and even people that feel just a little more familiar because they remind us of ourselves. For example, if your name is Sarah, you might be more drawn to a company called Sunrise Studios than BlackRock Media, even if you don't consciously notice why. If your name is Michael, you might think the city of Milwaukee just sounds a little nicer than average. It doesn't stop at preferences. This effect has been linked to bigger life decisions too. People are statistically more likely to live in cities or work in careers that start with the same letter as their names. A Laura might lean toward law, a dentist toward dentistry, not always, but enough to be measurable. It sounds strange, but your sense of identity subtly shapes your view of the world in ways that feel intuitive rather than deliberate. These preferences aren't based on logic or value. They're based on the unconscious comfort of recognition. Why does this happen? Because your name is one of the most emotionally loaded sounds in your entire life. It's tied to your sense of self. So, when something reflects a piece of your name back at you, your brain lights up with a kind of silent approval. Hey, that's part of me. It feels familiar, safe, and good, even if you don't know why. The name letter effect is a quiet reminder that we're always, in small and surprising ways, looking for ourselves in the world around us. You love a good story. Your brain naturally looks for causes, characters, and meaning, even when none of those things are really there. That's the narrative fallacy. The tendency to turn chaotic or random events into clean, understandable stories. When the stock market crashes, people immediately try to explain it with simple narratives. It was greed or bad leadership, even though the reality might involve hundreds of complex, interacting variables that no single story can capture. The story just feels better. It makes the chaos digestible. We do this with history too. We tell ourselves that one person's speech caused a revolution, or that a single invention changed the world overnight. In reality, these events were shaped by long, messy chains of coincidence, conflict, and context. But that doesn't make for a good story. So we simplify, we flatten, we insert heroes and villains where there may have been none. The narrative fallacy shows up in everyday life as well. If something good happens to you, you might say, "It's because I worked hard." And if something bad happens, you might say, it's because I messed up. And it doesn't stop with the past. The narrative fallacy affects how you predict the future, too. You imagine what's going to happen next based on the story you think you're in. If you see yourself as the underdog, you expect a dramatic comeback. If you think life has been too good lately, you brace for the twist. You're not just living your life, you're narrating it, shaping your memories and expectations into a story arc that may not be true. The problem isn't that stories are bad. They help us learn, relate, and find meaning. But the danger comes when we confuse the story with the truth. You often believe you have more control over things than you really do. That's the illusion of control, a mental glitch that makes you feel like you're steering the ship, even when you're just along for the ride. It shows up in small ways, like pressing the elevator button multiple times as if that'll make it come faster, or choosing your lottery numbers because it feels luckier than a random pick. It shows up in big ways too, like thinking your attitude alone can determine the outcome of a job interview, or that your rituals before a test or game somehow influence the results. This illusion is comforting. It gives you a sense of agency in a chaotic world. If things go well, it feels like your choices made it happen. If things go badly, at least it feels like you could have done something different. People often believe they can influence random events just by being more focused, confident, or careful, even when the outcome is pure chance. Gamblers roll the dice harder when they want a higher number and softer when they want a lower one, as if the force behind the roll actually matters. Investors believe their intuition can outsmart the market. Athletes stick to rituals they swear keep them winning. The illusion of control can be motivating. It pushes people to prepare, to act, to stay engaged. But it also makes failure feel more personal than it should. It leads to blame when things go wrong, not just toward others, but toward yourself. If only I had tried harder. If only I'd done X instead of Y. Sometimes bad outcomes happen, no matter what you do, and accepting that is uncomfortable. So the mind fills in a story where you were in charge all along, even when you weren't. In a way, the illusion of control is a paradox. It's false, but it helps you feel more stable. It's not entirely real, but it shapes real behavior. And while it can sometimes protect your confidence, it can also distort your understanding of risk, responsibility, and the true nature of uncertainty. Letting go of this illusion doesn't mean giving up. It means seeing reality more clearly. Knowing the difference between what you can control, what you can influence, and what you simply have to ride out. You think you know your own mind better than anyone else could, but the truth is, you often don't. That's the introspection illusion, the false belief that you have special access to the reasons behind your thoughts, decisions, and feelings. You assume that if you believe something, it's because you've thought it through. If you made a choice, it must have been for a logical reason. If you feel a certain way, it must reflect some deeper truth. But in reality, a huge part of what drives you happens beneath the surface, outside your awareness, and your mind fills in the blanks with guesses that feel like certainty. This illusion is so convincing that we rarely question it. When you decide you like a certain shirt, you might say it's because of the color or the fit, not realizing that you were subtly influenced by a commercial you saw, or by what someone else was wearing earlier. When asked why you voted a certain way, you might give a thoughtful explanation, but studies show that people often make political decisions emotionally or intuitively, then justify them after the fact with reasons that sound rational. And when you judge other people, you usually assume they are being influenced by bias or peer pressure, while insisting your own views come from deep reflection and inner truth. This creates a strange imbalance. You treat your own beliefs as transparent windows into reality, and other people's beliefs as tinted, distorted lenses. But you're not an exception. You're just not aware of how much your mind edits, filters, and rewrites your own thoughts. The introspection illusion isn't about lying to yourself on purpose. It's about how the brain builds a narrative that feels coherent, even if it's incomplete or wrong. It's not malicious. It's just how we're wired. The danger is that this illusion makes us overconfident in our own reasoning and too quick to dismiss others as irrational. It divides people, blocks empathy, and shuts down curiosity. Because if you already understand yourself perfectly, what's left to explore? But the truth is, the mind is deeper, stranger, and more mysterious than it seems on the surface. And sometimes, the most honest thing you can say is, I don't fully know why I think what I think, but I'm willing to find out. You think you understand how something works until someone asks you to explain it. Suddenly, your confidence starts to fall apart. That's the illusion of explanatory depth. It's the feeling that you understand complex systems better than you actually do. Take a bicycle or a toilet. You use them every day. You've seen them your whole life. You feel like you get how they work until someone says, "Okay, explain it to me step by step." And then you realize you can't. This illusion doesn't just apply to physical objects. It shows up in politics, science, philosophy, and nearly every area of life. You might feel like you understand how the economy functions, or why a certain policy is good or bad. But when you're asked to break it down in detail, no buzzwords, no slogans, you hit a wall. That's when the gap between feeling informed and being informed becomes clear. The illusion comes from mistaking familiarity for understanding. Because you've heard about something so often, your brain files it under known, even if you've never actually thought through the mechanics. It's like walking past the same tree every day and assuming you could draw every branch from memory. You can't, but your brain never had to know that until it was put to the test. What makes this illusion powerful and dangerous is that it fuels overconfidence. It makes us think we're qualified to debate, argue, or make decisions about things we barely grasp. And when everyone around us is under the same illusion, conversations become shallow echoes of certainty rather than deep explorations of truth. But there's also something freeing in recognizing it. Once you admit you don't know how something works, you open the door to curiosity instead of pretending you already have the answer. So, the next time you feel certain, ask yourself, could I teach this to a child without skipping steps? If not, you might be under the spell of the illusion of explanatory depth, and you wouldn't be alone. Say a word over and over again, like door, 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 door. And after a while, it starts to feel weird. It sounds foreign, like a noise detached from meaning, like it's not even a real word anymore. That's semantic satiation. It's a strange little glitch in how your brain connects language to meaning. When you repeat a word too many times in a short span, your neurons basically get tired of firing the same way, and the connection between the sound and its meaning temporarily breaks down. You're left with just the raw sound, stripped of the concept it once pointed to. It's a harmless effect, but it exposes something deep and unsettling about how fragile meaning really is. We like to think words are solid and reliable, but they're just patterns, sounds or shapes we've trained our brains to associate with ideas. Semantic satiation shows how quickly those associations can fade with repetition, as if the meaning we depend on is only loosely taped to the symbols we use. This illusion also hints at how much of our reality is constructed. Language doesn't just help us communicate, it actually shapes how we think, how we categorize the world, and how we feel about it. And yet, with enough repetition, that scaffolding starts to collapse. The word dissolves into sound, the meaning becomes slippery, the connection evaporates, even if just for a few seconds. And maybe that's what makes this bias so eerie. It's not just a brain quirk, it's a reminder that what feels obvious, solid, and meaningful can turn to noise with just a little pressure. Say it again. Door, door, door. What was once familiar now feels hollow. In the 1980s, neuroscientist Benjamin Libet conducted a series of experiments that shook the foundation of how we think about free will. He asked people to move their fingers whenever they felt like it, and then to report the moment they decided to move. Meanwhile, their brain activity was being recorded. What he found was strange. A spike in brain activity, called the readiness potential, would begin before the person became consciously aware of their decision. In other words, the brain had already started preparing the movement before the person thought, "I'm going to move now." This discovery led to a deep and unsettling question. If your brain starts the action before you decide to do it, then who or what is really in control? It suggests that what we experience as a conscious choice might just be a story we tell ourselves after the fact. The decision was already on its way. Your awareness just showed up late to the party. Some scientists argue that this doesn't disprove free will entirely. It might just mean that the decision happens in parts of the brain you're not aware of yet. Others believe it challenges the very idea of a unified, conscious self making choices in real time. It raises the possibility that consciousness might not be the driver of your actions, but more like a narrator explaining them after they happen. the implications are huge. If your sense of control is delayed, is your will really free? Is responsibility an illusion? And what does it mean for morality, for law, for the way we judge ourselves and others? Liebert's readiness potential doesn't answer these questions, but it opens the door to a strange and fascinating possibility, that the you who thinks it's making decisions might actually be the last to know. There are people walking around with two separate minds inside one body, and most of the time, you'd never know it. That's the split brain illusion. It comes from a rare but real medical procedure called a corpus callosotomy, where the bridge between the left and right hemispheres of the brain, the corpus callosum, is severed, usually to treat severe epilepsy. What happens next is one of the strangest discoveries in neuroscience. Each side of the brain continues to function, but they stop sharing information. And yet, the person still feels like one. Unified self. Here's where it gets weird. The left side of your brain, usually responsible for language, can't directly talk to the right side, which often processes visual and spatial information. So, if you show an image to just the right hemisphere, like a picture of a snow scene, and then ask the person to say what they saw, they'll say they saw nothing. But if you ask them to point to a shovel, their left hand will do it perfectly. The hand knows what the person doesn't know, because the two sides are no longer talking. Even stranger, if you ask the person to explain why they picked the shovel, the speaking hemisphere, the left brain, will make something up, like, "Oh, I saw a messy garage and thought of cleaning it." That's not just confusion, it's the left brain inventing a story to maintain the illusion of unity. It doesn't know the real reason, so it creates a fake one to avoid admitting ignorance. This illusion forces us to ask, what is a self? If you can split a brain and end up with two centers of awareness, which one is the real you? Or were there always multiple selves stitched together so seamlessly you never noticed? Split brain patients can live normal lives, hold jobs, have conversations, and think of themselves as a single person. But deep down, their brain is divided, two minds coexisting in one body, like roommates in the same apartment, each with its own view of the world. You often look back at events and feel like they were inevitable, that things had to happen the way they did. That's determinism bias. It's the illusion that outcomes are the result of a clear, linear chain of causes, when in reality, the world is full of chance and unpredictability. When something happens, an accident, a success, a disaster, you automatically start explaining it with tidy stories. They were always going to make it big, or that relationship was doomed from the start. You connect the dots in reverse, turning randomness into logic and spontaneity into fate. This bias gives us comfort. It makes the world feel more orderly, more explainable. If everything happens for a reason, then maybe nothing is truly out of our control. But the truth is, so much of what happens depends on timing, luck, context, things no one could have seen coming. A small change, a single moment, and history could unfold differently. Yet once we know the outcome, it's hard to imagine how it couldn't have happened. That's why people say they always knew a company would succeed after it becomes famous, or that a person's downfall was obvious in hindsight, even when no one saw it coming at the time. Determinism bias also shows up in how we judge others. We blame people for their failures as if they had complete control, forgetting the invisible forces, social, economic, psychological, that shape their choices. We expect people to have acted differently, even when we wouldn't have done better in their shoes. And when it comes to our own lives, we sometimes rewrite the past, convincing ourselves we chose paths that we actually stumbled into, as if every move was part of a master plan. But life isn't a script. It's more like a branching tree of possibilities, filled with what-ifs and could-have-beens. Determinism bias closes off those branches, flattening the complexity of reality into a single, neat story. And while that story might feel satisfying, it's often more illusion than truth. You feel like you're making choices freely, picking what to eat, when to speak, what to believe, but many of those choices are more predictable than you realize. That's the illusion of free will, the deeply convincing sense that you're calling the shots, when in many cases, your brain is following patterns set by biology, habit, environment, and even timing. Researchers have found that your brain often decides before you become aware of deciding. In one famous experiment, brain activity indicating a decision was detected several hundred milliseconds before the person consciously reported making that choice. It's like your mind is quietly writing the script and only afterward handing it to the part of you that feels like the author. This illusion shows up in the way you form opinions, too. You might think you've weighed the pros and cons and come to a logical conclusion, but often your brain makes a snap judgment based on gut feeling, emotion, or social influence. And then your reasoning brain jumps in to justify it. The choice feels deliberate, but the groundwork was laid long before your conscious mind got involved. You're nudged by marketing, primed by context, influenced by framing, and shaped by past experiences you barely remember. Even your preferences can be swayed by something as small as whether you're hungry, tired, or saw a certain color 5 seconds ago. And yet, the feeling of agency is so strong that it's hard to question. You remember choosing the red shirt, not being nudged by lighting in the store. You remember deciding to trust someone, not realizing their voice reminded you of someone you liked as a kid. Over and over again, we make decisions that feel free but are actually shaped by forces beneath our awareness. This doesn't mean free will is a complete illusion, but it does mean the version of free will we feel, the one that feels like we're steering the ship all the time, is far more complex than we think. The real control we have might not lie in every moment-to-moment decision, but in how we respond once we become aware of the patterns. Once you realize how much is happening behind the scenes, you start to ask deeper questions. Who's really making the choices? And how much of you is really under your control? You think you're experiencing the world directly, just as it is, but you're not. What you're actually experiencing is a mental reconstruction, a private simulation created by your brain. That's the heart of phenomenal illusions. The idea that your conscious experience feels complete, accurate, and seamless, even though it's filled with shortcuts, guesses, and gaps. Take your field of vision. You feel like you're seeing everything in full detail all the time, but you're really only seeing a tiny spot in high resolution. Your brain fills in the rest. Or consider color. You believe you're seeing the world in true, objective color, but color isn't something that exists out there. It's something your mind invents to help you navigate light wavelengths. You feel like the world is filled with rich, continuous sound, but your brain is stitching together fragments of noise and translating vibrations into experience. Even the feeling of now is a phenomenal illusion. Your brain takes time to process information, yet your consciousness edits and smooths everything to feel like it's happening in real time. You don't notice the lag. You just feel present. That's the illusion. You're not seeing reality as it is. You're seeing a user-friendly version, like a desktop interface hiding the code underneath. And perhaps the most powerful illusion of all is that your experience feels like it's happening to a unified self, a you at the center of everything, observing, choosing, controlling. But neuroscience suggests that your sense of self may also be a constructed story, a product of distributed brain systems working together. The brain doesn't just simulate the world, it simulates you within it. Phenomenal illusions don't mean reality isn't real. They just remind us that what we experience is a filtered, crafted, deeply personal version of it. What feels obvious and immediate, like color, time, sound, even your sense of being you, is more like a best guess rendering from a mind that's doing its best with the data it has. You don't see the world as it is. You see the world as your brain tells you it is. You start to notice patterns, too many coincidences, strange alignments, or moments that feel scripted, and a thought creeps in. What if this isn't real? What if we're living in a simulation? That's simulation hypothesis bias, the tendency to interpret glitches, mysteries, or unexplained events as evidence that reality itself is artificial. It's not necessarily about believing in the simulation theory as a scientific claim. It's more about a shift in perception, where the mind begins to frame everyday life through the lens of, what if this is all coded? You see a number repeated over and over, on the clock, on receipts, in headlines, and it feels like a message. You think about someone, and they call. You dream something, and it happens. These moments aren't proof of anything, but they feel meaningful. And because your brain is a pattern detection machine, it fills in gaps, makes connections, and whispers, that can't be a coincidence. Simulation hypothesis bias feeds on that feeling. It transforms ambiguity into evidence. Instead of, that's odd, it becomes, the simulation is glitching. This bias is fueled by pop culture and tech culture alike. Movies, games, and science fiction make the idea of simulated worlds seem not only plausible, but familiar. Add in the rise of virtual reality and AI, and it becomes easier to imagine that consciousness itself could be part of a digital framework. And once the idea is planted, it's hard to unsee. Even perfectly normal things start to feel orchestrated, like the universe is nudging you, like your reality is being curated. The danger is that this bias can detach you from the rawness of life. It can create a sense of unreality that numbs emotions, distances relationships, and blurs the boundary between imagination and observation. On one hand, it can be a playful philosophical curiosity. On the other, it can become a deep existential doubt, because if everything is fake, then what really matters? But maybe that's the trick. The bias doesn't prove the world is simulated. It just shows how easily the human mind questions the ground beneath its feet. Whether or not the simulation is real, the feeling of questioning it definitely is. And that alone says something profound about the nature of awareness itself. You naturally see the world through human eyes, because you're human. But this creates a powerful illusion that humans are the most important thing in existence, that everything in the universe either revolves around us or should. This is anthropocentric bias, and it's so deeply embedded in our thinking that we often don't even notice it. We assume that intelligence looks like human intelligence, that life elsewhere would act the way we do, that meaning must somehow involve us. Even when we talk about saving the planet, we usually mean saving it for ourselves. When we look at animals, we measure their worth by how similar they are to humans. A chimpanzee using a stick to get termites is called smart, but a jellyfish drifting with the current is just a blob. We give more ethical concern to dogs and dolphins than to insects or plants, even though every organism is part of the same complex web of life. It's not that we've thought deeply about it, it's just how our minds are built. Our language, our stories, our science, even our religions tend to place humanity at the center, as the focus of attention, the reason for the story, the exception to the rule. This bias stretches into science and philosophy too. We interpret randomness as intention and coincidence as meaning. When we see patterns in nature, we assume they exist for our benefit. A beautiful sunset must be for our enjoyment. A cure in a rainforest must have been put there for us to discover. We're not wrong to feel awe, but awe doesn't mean ownership. Even the idea of the Earth being in a Goldilocks zone is a human-centered term. It's not too hot, not too cold, just right for us. But the universe isn't trying to be comfortable, it simply is. What we see as special might just be rare coincidence, filtered through a lens that's always looking for significance. Recognizing anthropocentric bias doesn't make humans less important, it just puts us in context. It reminds us that we're part of something unimaginably vast, not the authors of it. And strangely, that can be more humbling and meaningful than believing everything was made for us. Because it means that meaning isn't handed to us. It's something we create. You crave certainty. You want answers, conclusions, a sense of finality, because uncertainty feels like standing on shaky ground. That's the cognitive closure illusion, the comforting but misleading sense that you've figured it out, that things are settled, that you finally know how the world works. It's not just about knowledge, it's about relief. The moment a confusing event or complex problem gets a label, an explanation, or a story that makes sense, your brain relaxes. You feel safe. But that feeling can be deceptive. This illusion makes you jump to conclusions just to escape the discomfort of not knowing. You might accept the first explanation that sounds plausible, not because it's the best one, but because it allows you to stop thinking. It's why conspiracy theories are so attractive. They offer neat, complete stories for chaotic events. It's why people cling to rigid ideologies or beliefs, even when evidence suggests nuance or complexity. Once your mind believes it has closure, it becomes resistant to reopening that door. This bias shows up in everyday life too. You hear a rumor and instantly believe it because it fills in a blank space. You misinterpret a friend's tone, assume the worst, and stop asking questions, because it's easier to feel sure than to stay uncertain. You diagnose someone's behavior with a simple label: toxic, jealous, crazy, and move on, never stopping to wonder if the full story might be more complicated. The danger of the cognitive closure illusion is that it shuts down curiosity. It tells you that the work of thinking is over when it's really just begun. And while some decisions in life need to be made quickly, the most important questions about people, purpose, reality, rarely come with instant clarity. Sometimes the wisest thing you can do is hold the uncertainty a little longer, to admit, I don't know yet. Right now, you're seeing colors, hearing sounds, feeling the weight of your body, and maybe even thinking about what all this means. And yet, it all feels like one unified experience. That's the binding problem of consciousness. How does your brain take millions of separate signals, sight, sound, touch, thought, memory, and combine them into one seamless moment of awareness? Your visual system processes color in one area, motion in another. Your hearing, your sense of space, your emotions, all handled by different regions, firing independently. But you don't experience them as separate. You experience one world, one self, one present moment. Why? There's no central place in the brain where it all gets stitched together. Neurons communicate, yes, but they don't pass their information to a single you sitting inside your head, watching the show. Neuroscience has mapped out how different functions happen, but no one knows how those pieces are unified into consciousness itself. It's as if someone took thousands of jigsaw puzzle pieces from different puzzles, scattered them randomly, and somehow you still ended up with a perfect whole picture every single second. Some theories say it's about timing, neurons firing in sync. Others suggest it's more like a narrative, with the brain telling itself a story to maintain coherence. But even those ideas just move the mystery around. Why should timing create the feeling of unity? Why does a narrative feel like you experiencing the story? And what's doing the experiencing? The binding problem isn't just a glitch in our understanding of the brain. It's a deep question about what it even means to have a mind. Why doesn't your consciousness feel like a collection of disconnected data streams? Why does it feel like you, here, now, living through a moment that somehow makes sense? The brain is made of parts, but the mind, your mind, feels like a whole, and no one fully knows why. You can describe how the brain works in incredible detail, how neurons fire, how signals move, how certain chemicals correlate with emotions and thoughts. But none of that explains why it feels like something to be you. That's the hard problem of consciousness. Why doesn't all this brain activity just happen in the dark, without any inner experience? Why does pain hurt, or red look red, or music move you emotionally? We can measure the brain's activity when you feel joy, but that doesn't tell us what joy feels like from the inside. That subjective quality, what philosophers call qualia, is at the core of the mystery. It's not just a technical problem. It's a philosophical wall we keep running into. We can build machines that mimic decision-making, recognize faces, respond to voices, but do they experience anything? Or are they just simulating the appearance of thought and feeling? And what would even count as proof that something is conscious? The hard problem reminds us that consciousness isn't just about function or behavior. It's about experience, and no scientific equation, no brain scan, no algorithm has yet bridged the gap between physical processes and the first-person feeling of being alive. Some people think we'll crack it eventually. Others believe we're fundamentally missing something, that consciousness might be beyond the reach of physical science altogether. Maybe it's an emergent property, maybe it's built into the fabric of the universe, or maybe it's something we don't even have the right language to describe yet. But one thing's for sure, you are aware, you are experiencing this moment, and no one, not even the best scientist in the world, can fully explain why. That's the hard problem of consciousness. It's not just hard, it's possibly the deepest mystery of existence. You think there's a solid you behind your thoughts, feelings, and experiences, a central self that's consistent, unified, and in control. But that sense of a permanent self may be just an illusion. The more closely you look at your mind, the harder it is to find any single place where you reside. Your memories change over time. Your personality shifts in different situations. Your thoughts come and go like weather. Yet you feel like there's a you tying it all together. That's the self-illusion. You might imagine your mind as a movie theater, with a little person inside watching your life unfold. But who's watching that person? And who's watching the watcher? The more you dig, the more the idea of a single, unchanging self starts to unravel. Neuroscience has never found a self-center in the brain. Instead, it finds countless systems working together, processing vision, language, emotion, decision-making, all loosely coordinated, but with no one part clearly in charge. Consciousness emerges from this collaboration, but it doesn't require a fixed identity behind the scenes. This illusion runs deep. You take credit for your choices, even though studies show many of them happen before you're even aware of deciding. You tell stories about your life to make it seem coherent, even though those stories are constantly edited, revised, and filtered through emotion and hindsight. You think of yourself as a single unified being, but the truth is, you're more like a crowd of voices taking turns with the microphone. One moment you're calm and rational, the next you're impulsive and reactive, and later you reflect on it all like you're the narrator of someone else's story. The self-illusion isn't necessarily a problem. In fact, it helps you navigate the world, build relationships, and maintain a sense of stability. But it also traps you. You become attached to your ego, defensive of your image, fearful of losing something that was never fixed to begin with. Letting go of the illusion doesn't mean you stop existing. It means you stop clinging to the idea that you're a single solid thing. You're not a noun, you're a process. And realizing that might just be the most freeing insight of all. You can think about your own thinking, but not as clearly or deeply as you might believe. That's metacognitive myopia, a blind spot in how well you understand your own cognitive limits. You might be good at spotting flaws in other people's reasoning, but when it comes to your own mind, you're less objective than you think. You believe you're being fair, rational, and open-minded, but you don't see how your thoughts are shaped by unseen biases, emotions, shortcuts, and habits that you rarely question. You believe you're paying attention, but you miss important details. You believe you're being logical, but you may just be rationalizing. And through it all, you feel confident, because the mind doesn't easily reveal its own blind spots. It's like trying to see your own eyes without a mirror. The tools you use to evaluate your thinking are the same tools that are already biased. If your logic is flawed, your judgment of your own logic will also be flawed. That's the trap. You might notice when you forget something, but you don't notice the things you never knew. You're aware when you change your mind, but not always aware of how hard it is for you to change it. You think your beliefs are based on evidence, but often they're based on intuition, emotion, or social pressure that you later dress up with reasons. And even when you know these traps exist, that knowledge doesn't automatically help you avoid them. You might even feel like you're the exception. This illusion of self-awareness can be comforting. It lets you feel in control, certain, and smart. But it also prevents growth. It's hard to improve your thinking if you overestimate how well you already think. You might reject feedback too quickly or ignore contradictions too easily. You think you're seeing things clearly, but your brain is quietly smoothing over complexities, filtering out inconvenient truths, and filling in gaps with guesses. Metacognitive myopia is why humility matters. Not the kind of fake modesty that still assumes you're mostly right, but a real, uncomfortable awareness that your own mind is often hidden from itself. It's a reminder that clarity takes effort, self-trust requires caution, and even your most confident thoughts might be built on invisible sand. There are some thoughts that can never fully settle, like chasing your own tail with logic. That's the strange territory of Gödelian loops of reason. Named after the mathematician Kurt Gödel, these loops reveal a fundamental truth. In any system complex enough to describe itself, there will be statements that are true but can't be proven within that system. It's like trying to define the word dictionary using only the word dictionary. You end up in a loop, circular, self-referential, and impossible to complete. This isn't just a problem for mathematicians. It's a philosophical wake-up call. It means that no matter how logically consistent your worldview is, there will always be truths that slip through the cracks, truths that your system can't reach without breaking its own rules. You can build a belief system that feels airtight, but if it tries to explain itself fully, it collapses inward. It's like using a book to prove the accuracy of the book. It can't step outside itself to validate itself. This loop shows up in real life too. Think about the question: Can everything be explained rationally? If you try to answer that question using only rational tools, you're stuck inside the very frame you're questioning. You can't get outside your own mind to fully verify your mind's conclusions. It's the same paradox as a sentence that says, "This statement is unprovable." If it's true, it's unprovable. But if it's unprovable, then it must be true. Gödelian loops remind us that some parts of reality might always remain out of reach, not because we're not smart enough, but because the structure of thought itself has blind spots. Even logic, the most trusted tool of human reason, has limits baked into it. The deeper you go, the more you realize. The mind can't completely contain itself. There's always a corner you can't quite see around. What if everything you believe, everything you see, hear, feel, and think, is being manipulated by something smarter than you? That's the unsettling idea behind the evil demon illusion. Imagine a powerful being, not evil in the Hollywood sense, but cunning and completely dedicated to deceiving you. It feeds you fake sensations, fake memories, fake logic, creating a seamless illusion of reality. You touch a warm cup of coffee, hear the hum of your refrigerator, feel certain that 2 plus 2 equals 4. But what if every one of those experiences is carefully planted in your mind by a deceiver? Not just your senses, but your thoughts, your entire reasoning process, could be part of the trick. René Descartes used this scenario not because he thought it was likely, but because he wanted to find out what, if anything, could be known with absolute certainty. If an evil demon could fabricate all your experiences, then even the most obvious truths might be illusions. Maybe the world doesn't exist. Maybe your body doesn't exist. Maybe nothing you've ever known was real. Descartes pushed skepticism to the limit until he reached one thing the demon couldn't fake: your awareness that you are thinking. Even if you're being deceived, there must be a you being deceived. That's where he landed on his famous phrase, "I think, therefore I am." But here's where it gets strange. In a modern context, the evil demon illusion looks a lot like a simulated reality, like the Matrix or a computer-generated world. It forces you to ask, how do you know your thoughts aren't being fed to you by something else? If your brain can be fooled by dreams, illusions, hallucinations, or even simple magic tricks, how much more could a superintelligent deceiver fool you? And if it could, how would you ever know? This illusion doesn't just make you doubt the world. It makes you doubt the very tools you use to understand the world. Your senses, your logic, your intuition, all potentially hijacked. It's a terrifying, radical idea. But also, in a strange way, liberating. Because if you can question everything, maybe you can also rebuild your understanding from the ground up. Not based on what you've been told or what's convenient, but on what can actually survive doubt. You mistake your ideas about reality for reality itself. That's map territory confusion. The map is your mental model, the words, beliefs, symbols, theories, or categories you use to navigate the world. The territory is what actually exists, regardless of how you describe it. But once the map becomes detailed and familiar, it starts to feel like the thing it represents. You begin to act as though your labels are the truth. You stop questioning the limits of your understanding and start mistaking the label for the thing, the concept for the experience, the word for the world. Think about how we use names. When you call someone lazy, you create a shortcut, a map, that reduces a complex human being into one trait. You stop seeing everything they are and only see the idea you've assigned to them. When you call a place dangerous, or a person evil, or a country advanced, you're compressing layers of nuance into something your brain can easily carry. But it's a map, not the full terrain. Maps are necessary. We need them to think, plan, and communicate. But they are always simplifications, and when we forget that, we start living in an illusion. Science does this too. A model of the atom is not an atom. A psychological diagnosis is not a person. A political ideology is not reality. Even our sense of self, our story of who we are, is a kind of map. It's helpful for navigating life, but it's never the full picture. The problem arises when we confuse these tools for truth itself, and then close ourselves off from anything that doesn't fit inside them. This bias becomes dangerous when people defend the map more fiercely than they explore the territory. They cling to ideologies, identities, and theories, and treat challenges to those ideas as threats. But ideas are tools, not truths. The moment you forget that, The map becomes a cage instead of a guide. Understanding map territory confusion doesn't mean discarding your beliefs. It means staying aware that your beliefs are representations, approximations, and it means being willing to update your map when the territory proves otherwise. There's a strange thought that might cross your mind late at night or during a quiet walk alone. What if you're the only conscious being in existence? What if everyone else, your friends, your family, every stranger you pass on the street, is just part of some elaborate illusion? That idea is called solipsism. And the solipsism trap is the mental spiral it can pull you into. It's the unsettling sense that while you can be sure of your own thoughts and experiences, you can't actually prove that anyone else has a mind like yours. You see people laugh, cry, speak, and act like they're alive inside, but all of that could be just outward behavior, reflections, simulations, even programmed responses in a dream or a game you're unknowingly playing. It's not just a philosophical question, it's a psychological trap that can distort how you see the world. If you fall too deep into it, you might start to feel isolated, disconnected, or even paranoid. After all, if no one else is real, then nothing really matters outside your own mind. Love, trust, morality, are they still meaningful if you're the only one truly experiencing them? The solipsism trap plays on the limits of human perception. You can't experience another person's consciousness directly. You can't step into their thoughts or feel their feelings from the inside. So there's always that lingering doubt. How do you know they're really there? Most people brush off the idea and move on, but for some, it lingers in the background like a glitch in the matrix. It can make reality feel thin, dreamlike, or artificial. And ironically, the more intelligent or introspective you are, the easier it is to fall into this line of questioning. But here's the thing. Just because you can't prove something doesn't mean it isn't real. Other people probably do have minds. They react, surprise you, disagree with you, comfort you in ways no programmed illusion ever could. And even if you were the only conscious being in the universe, wouldn't it still make sense to live as if others mattered? To choose empathy, kindness, and meaning, not because you know they're real, but because you hope they are? The solipsism trap isn't a dead end. It's a reminder of how limited, and yet how powerful our perception is. It shows just how fragile and mysterious consciousness really is. But instead of spiraling into doubt, you can use it to deepen your appreciation for the strange and beautiful possibility that we're not alone, that every mind you encounter is its own universe, just as real and alive as yours. You want to believe that you can build a perfectly closed system of knowledge, where every question has an answer, every belief fits neatly into a bigger picture, and every contradiction can eventually be resolved. But the truth is, you can't. That's what epistemic closure failure reveals. The unsettling reality that your understanding of the world may never fully close, like an incomplete puzzle with missing pieces you can't even identify. You might think, if I just keep learning, eventually I'll figure it all out. But the more you know, the more you realize how much remains uncertain, or even unknowable. You might answer one question only to find it opens 10 more. You form beliefs based on logic, evidence, and experience. But no matter how carefully you build your worldview, there's always something outside the system that can't be accounted for. New data, shifting perspectives, unknown unknowns. This is especially frustrating because it feels like there should be closure. You crave it. The mind wants completeness. It wants to feel like it has a grip on reality. But reality doesn't always cooperate. Philosophers hit it when they try to define knowledge itself. Scientists encounter it at the edges of what can be measured. Mathematicians confront it in paradoxes and undecidable truths. Even in your daily life, you face it when you try to reconcile opposing beliefs or explain something you feel but can't articulate. Epistemic closure failure doesn't mean you can't know anything. It means you probably can't know everything, and especially not in the airtight, self-contained way your mind wishes it could. There will always be cracks, gaps, and mysteries, places where certainty slips through your fingers. The illusion is that one more theory, one more breakthrough, one more insight will finally complete the picture. And yet, this isn't a failure of thought, it's a feature of being human. To live with openness rather than closure is to stay curious, humble, and awake. It's to accept that the world is bigger than your models of it, and that wisdom sometimes means letting the unknown stay unknown. You live your life assuming reality is just there, solid, obvious, reliable. You trust your senses, your memories, your thoughts. The world feels stable, filled with objects and people and rules. But the more you question what real even means, the more it starts to slip through your fingers. This is the illusion of reality itself, the quiet, unsettling possibility that everything you take for granted might be a kind of dream, a projection, a construct, or something far stranger than you can imagine. Science tells you your senses are easily tricked. Optical illusions, false memories, virtual simulations, all of them show how easy it is to experience something vividly without it being real. Philosophy goes deeper. How do you know you're not in a simulation? How do you know anything exists beyond your mind? Even the language you use to describe the world is just a map, not the territory. Words like time, matter, and self feel intuitive, but under close inspection, they dissolve into paradoxes, probabilities, and abstractions. You see color, but it's just your brain interpreting wavelengths. You feel solidness, but atoms are mostly empty space. You remember the past, but your memory is reconstructed, not recorded. Every part of your experience is filtered through a mind you didn't design, shaped by biases you didn't choose, operating in a universe you don't fully understand. And yet, you keep going, confidently labeling things as real or fake, true or false. You've just explored 100 ways the mind bends what's real, through illusions that deceive your senses and biases that quietly shape your beliefs, decisions, and identity. Some were playful, some unsettling, and some pointed at something much deeper, that the way you think isn't always something you control. Cognitive illusions reveal that what you see isn't always what's there. Cognitive biases show that what you believe isn't always what's true. Together, they form the strange, beautiful, flawed machinery of human thought. But awareness is power. The more clearly you see the distortions, the more clearly you can begin to see yourself. So, stay open, stay aware, and most of all, stay curious. Thanks for watching Level 1 to 100 Cognitive Illusions and Biases. See you in the next one.